Some empires collapse because of war. Some dynasties vanish because of plague. But there are ages in history that rot from the inside because of a fine white powder. It began gently enough, just a green leaf that helped mountain people feel less hungry, less dizzy. Then it stepped into European laboratories, into the health tonics of the upper class, into soft drinks advertised as good for you. Eventually, it slipped into cartel suitcases, into the pockets of politicians, into lungs and bloodstreams all over the world. Tonight, as you lie still and close your eyes, we'll walk slowly through the history of the powder that quietly corrupted dynasties to see how we helped it grow so powerful and how it made the entire world pay the price. High in the Andes, the air is so thin it feels like the sky has been stretched too tight. Every step takes effort. Every breath feels just slightly insufficient. If you've ever climbed a staircase too fast and felt that sudden burn in your chest, imagine living in that sensation every day. Imagine building cities out of stone, terracing mountainsides, carrying loads up slopes where even standing still can make you lightheaded. For the people of the high Andes, that was not a hiking trip. It was home. Long before there were borders or maps or flags, a small green leaf began to weave itself into this harsh landscape. The coca plant does not look particularly magical. It's not tall, not towering, not flamboyant, just a modest shrub, waist-high, with smooth oval leaves the color of polished jade. But in the thin air of the mountains, this unremarkable bush became a kind of quiet miracle. If you were a shepherd, walking for hours along a narrow path that sliced across the cliffs, you reached into your woven pouch, pulled out a few leaves, and placed them in your cheek. Chew slowly. Mix them with a bit of powdered ash or lime to coax out their strength. Within minutes, the ache in your legs softened. Your breath came a little easier. The gnawing emptiness of hunger moved just a bit further away. There was no hallucination, no explosion of color, just a gentle turning down of the body's alarm bells. To those who lived up here, it felt less like getting high and more like returning to normal in a world that constantly threatened to push you below it. Over generations, this simple act of chewing leaves became more than a habit. It turned into a language of its own. Two men meeting on a mountain trail might exchange coca leaves before exchanging words. A farmer might tuck a small offering of leaves into a stone crevice before planting his crops, asking the spirits of the earth to be kind. When someone died, a little pouch of coca might be placed near the body, a quiet provision for the journey no one could map. The mountains were not gentle. They were gods in their own right, unpredictable, demanding, often cruel. Lightning, sudden storms, landslides, inexplicable illnesses. In a world like that, it made a certain sense to believe that anything which eased suffering must have a foot in the realm of the divine. By the time the Inca Empire rose and began to organize these scattered highland cultures into something vast and tightly controlled, coca was already old news, a tradition with roots so deep no one could remember when it began. The Incas did not invent coca, but they understood its power immediately. Imagine a state run with the precision of a clock and the spirituality of a temple. Roads carved into impossible places. Granaries stocked with food for years of bad harvests. Armies that could march across continents of rock and ice. In the middle of that machine, small green leaves sat like sacred gears. The Incas gave coca a name that sounded like a prayer. Mama Coca, Mother Coca. Not just a plant, but a presence, a spirit that had agreed somehow to help humans survive where they were never meant to thrive. According to their legends, the sun god himself had gifted Coca to relieve the suffering of his children on earth. But like all divine gifts, it came with conditions. You could not simply wake up one morning, decide you wanted to chew coca all day, and do it. The Inca state watched over the plant the way a priest watches over a relic. The most sacred leaves went to the emperor and his court, to priests who needed to read omens, to important visitors, to generals, to those whose decisions would move armies and alter the course of rivers. When an Inca priest wanted to consult the unseen, he didn't reach for a book. He took a mouthful of coca, let the bitterness soak into his tongue, and then carefully chewed until the warmth spread through his body. He might then chew, spit, cast the chewed leaves onto a ceremonial cloth and study the patterns they formed as they fell. Were they clustered, scattered? Did they form a line, a cross, a strange shape? To you and me, it might look like a handful of damp green pulp. To him, it was a map of the near future, a war to be fought or avoided, a journey to be blessed or postponed. Somewhere between chemistry and faith, the leaf became a lens through which the empire read its own destiny. But the Incas were also brutally practical. They didn't only reserve coca for priests in quiet temples. They understood its value in sweat and stone. Think of the mita system, massive waves of labor conscription that built fortresses, temples, terraces, and roads. Hundreds, thousands of men, taken from their homes, marched to the mountains and told to work. You cannot build Machu Picchu on motivation alone. You need something to push the human body past the point where it normally stops. Coca became a ration, as essential as maize, a measured handful each day for those who labored under the sun at impossible heights, not as a reward, not as a luxury, but as fuel. And then there were the runners. The Inca runners, chasquis, were living nerves in the empire's body. They carried messages, small parcels, sometimes fresh fish, from the coast to the inland capital in a matter of days across mountains that would leave most of us breathless in minutes. You can picture them waiting at little stone outposts, barefoot, alert, watching the horizon for the next runner's arrival. When the incoming messenger appeared, lungs heaving, you would pass the message, sometimes a knotted string of quipu, sometimes spoken instructions. The next runner would pivot and launch forward without pause, a human relay baton of muscle and will. At each station, one thing was always present, a stash of coca leaves. A runner arriving half collapsed from his sprint might take a moment, fill his mouth with fresh leaves, feel the familiar bitterness spread, and push on. A small, quiet ritual, repeated thousands of times. One leaf, one breath, one more mile. The empire's roads were stone and earth. Its messengers were flesh and bone. But its endurance is partly green. It's tempting, from the outside, to see this as exploitation. And in some ways, it was. The state controlled the plant, decided who received it, used it as a lever to extract work, loyalty, and obedience. But for those who actually chewed it, who stood on cold ridgelines with lungs burning, coca was also a friend, a small, personal miracle attached to their own survival. The Inca world didn't draw a hard line between the practical and the mystical. A stone could be both building material and deity. A river could be both water source and spirit. Coca lived in that same in-between space, a chemical tool that worked in the bloodstream, and a sacred gift you dared not handle carelessly. In grave sites high in the Andes and along the Peruvian coast, archaeologists have found mummies wrapped in fine textiles. Their hair still braided, their faces still turned slightly to the side as if listening. Near them, almost always, is the same simple object, a small pouch. Inside, a cluster of dried coca leaves, carefully preserved. Centuries later, the alkaloids are still detectable in their hair. Proof, if science needs it, that these people lived with coca in their veins as much as in their myths. To them, the plant was not a drug problem. It was a covenant with the mountains. A quiet agreement that said, if we care for you and respect your power, you will help us breathe in a place that does not want us to. For thousands of years, that covenant held. The leaf stayed close to its slopes, nestled in woven pouches, passed from hand to hand, chewed in silence while the wind roared against cliffs and the stars watched from above. No one in those terraces could have imagined that one day, far away, their leaf would be broken down, purified, crystallized, and turned into a powder that would travel in private jets, sit on glass tables, and bankroll wars in cities they would never see. For now, high in the Andes, it was still just green, still just a plant that helped humans breathe where gods had once walked alone. And somewhere in that thin air, the first shadow of everything that would follow was already beginning to stir. For a long time, the high Andes were their own self-contained universe. The people who lived there knew the sharpness of the wind, the way the clouds hugged the cliffs, the comforting bitterness of coca against the tongue. They did not know that, far across an ocean, men were studying maps with empty spaces and dreaming of metal. When the Spanish arrived, they did not disembark from their ships with poems about the beauty of the mountains. They came with soldiers, priests, and paperwork. On the surface, their mission was double: convert souls and extract wealth. The second aim turned out to be much simpler than the first. Somewhere between the mountains and the sky stood Cerro Rico, the rich hill, the mountain of Potosi. To the indigenous people, mountains were living beings with moods and tempers. To the Spanish, this one looked like word spread quickly, a mountain of silver, not just veins, not just scattered nuggets, but so much metal that people joked you could build a bridge of pure silver from the Andes all the way to Madrid. Suddenly, the empire had a heartbeat, and it pulsed in silver. But you don't pull metal from rock with greedy thoughts alone. You need bodies, lots of them. Enter the meta, the labor draft. The Incas had used a version of it already, forcing communities to send workers for big projects, but they balanced it with food reserves, festivals, and a sense of reciprocity with the gods. The Spanish liked the idea of a ready-made labor system, but they stripped out the parts they didn't need, like balance, ritual, and mercy. One day, you're a farmer cultivating potatoes and maize on terraced slopes. The next, your name is called, and your march toward Potosi, toward air so thin it feels like God is pressing a thumb on your chest. Picture the first time a group of these conscripted men step onto the slopes of Cerro Rico. The mountain doesn't look like a spirit anymore. It looks tired, its skin punctured by dark openings, its sides scarred by carts and shacks and smoke. At the base, Spanish officials bark orders. Above, makeshift ladders and crude supports crawl up the slopes like an infestation. Somewhere in this chaos, a small, familiar comfort still exists. Coca. At first, the Spanish hate what they see. Men huddled outside the mine entrance, mouths bulging slightly on one side, chewing. Green bundles being passed hand to hand, like secret contraband among prisoners. To the priests, coca is suspicious. It's tied to rituals they don't understand, to gods they have been instructed to erase. Sermons are delivered with great righteousness. This leaf is an obstacle to salvation, a relic of idolatry, a distraction from the one true faith. For a moment, it seems like the leaf may vanish under decrees and denunciations. And then, the ore carts come out. The silver is counted. The numbers are written down. And someone notices a pattern that has nothing to do with theology. The workers who chew coca can go longer without food. They work deeper in the tunnels. They stay on their feet through the long hours of suffocating darkness. The ones who don't collapse more often, get sick sooner, die faster. From a distance, in a ledger book, the difference is simple. Coca users are cheaper. Feed them less. Push them harder. Replace them less frequently. Suddenly, the questions asked about coca change. Not, is this a sin? But, does this improve output? And just like that, a miracle happens. Not the holy kind, but the economic kind. The same leaf that had been condemned from the pulpit becomes quietly protected from the counting house. Bans soften into restrictions. Restrictions turn into regulations. Regulations turn into licenses. Licenses turn into land grants. Priests who once called coca the work of the devil discover that owning a coca field helps fund their missions, their buildings, their personal comfort. A plantation here, a share in a coca-growing valley there. All for the greater glory of God, of course. On the slopes, the miners don't see these decisions being made. All they know is that when a truck or llama caravan arrives with their rations, there might be dried maize, a bit of dried meat, and, if their overseers expect a particularly grueling shift, a carefully measured portion of coca leaves. The leaf has changed category. It is no longer purely sacred. It is no longer purely communal. Now, it is a wage. The miner who once offered coca to the earth before planting now receives it from a foreman who expects more hours, more output, more silver. It's as if Mama Coca, the mother coca, has been conscripted too. She now works double shifts for the Spanish crown. Deep inside the mountain, things are worse than any sermon about hell. Tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through. Toxic dust scraping at lungs. Crude supports creaking under the weight of rock. Some men never see the surface again. They sleep in underground barracks, mouths stained dark green, chewing and working, chewing and working. Their lives measured in carts of ore. They still pray. Some pray to the Christian God they've been told about at Mass. Some whisper to the old mountain spirits, in the language the priests try to shove out of their mouths. Many pray to both, because when you are trapped between stone and death, any ear that might be listening is welcome. It's easy to think of the Spanish as a single block of cruelty, but even among them, there are splits. A young priest might stand at the edge of a shaft and feel his stomach twist at what he sees. He knows that the silver he blesses at the altar tomorrow was paid for with these men's collapsed lungs and broken backs. He also knows that if he speaks too loudly, he could lose his position, his patron, his life. So he does what humans often do in uncomfortable systems. He looks away and calls it God's mysterious will. Meanwhile, the silver caravans roll on, out of the mountain, down the roads, to the coast, onto ships that creak under their shining cargo, across the ocean that silver becomes pay for soldiers, spoons on royal tables, mercury for more refining, and coins that jingle in the pockets of merchants who never see a coca leaf in their lives. They taste the wealth, but not the bitterness of the green. Back in the Andes, something subtle has shifted in the people's relationship with coca. Once, a farmer chose when and how to use it. He might share it at a festival, offer it to a friend as a gesture of trust, or keep it for long journeys. Now, someone else sets the dose. Someone who doesn't chew it, doesn't pray over it, doesn't see it as a being with a spirit, but as a variable in a profit equation. The leaf hasn't changed. Its chemistry is exactly the same. What's changed is its place in the story. Coca has gone from gift of the gods to instrument of empire. That twist from sacred to strategic is one of the quiet tragedies of colonialism. It doesn't always burn temples or tear down statues. Sometimes it simply picks up a ritual object, weighs it, and says, "This makes the numbers go up. We'll keep it." Machines hum louder. Ledgers grow thicker. Prayers get shorter. If you zoom out, you can see 3 layers operating at once. On the ground, an exhausted miner chews coca to survive his shift. In the colony's capital, an official signs a document encouraging coca production for the sake of stability and productivity. In a European court, a noble woman admires a piece of silver jewelry, unaware that a leaf she has never seen helped pull it from the earth. Coca has become invisible in the very places that benefit most from it. And here's the strangest twist of all. For 300 years, the leaf's role in this brutal system stays largely confined to the Andes. Europe enjoys the silver, but barely notices the plant. Ships sail back and forth across the Atlantic, sails full of wind, holds full of treasure. Yet the most important cargo of all has not crossed the ocean yet. Not the leaf itself, but the idea of it. The curiosity about why this simple plant can hold off hunger and fatigue. The scientific urge to break it apart and name its essence. That curiosity is still dormant, like a seed waiting for the right season. For now, coca remains green and chewed. Silver flows. Empires grow fat. Mountains grow hollow. And somewhere in a future century, a chemist will open a parcel of dried leaves from a place he has never visited and ask a deceptively simple question: what exactly is inside this? When he finds the answer, coca will finally leave the Andes, not as a leaf, but as a white crystal that the world will mistake for magic and later learn to fear. For centuries, coca stayed mainly where it was born. High on the stone terraces, it rode in the cheek of a runner, sat in the pouch of a farmer, rested in the hands of priests who whispered to mountains and stars. Then one day, something almost comical happened. Someone put it in the mail. Not literally a postcard, of course, but dried bundles of coca leaves, wrapped, labeled, and shipped across the Atlantic as botanical specimens. To European scientists, they weren't sacred. They were samples. If the Andes saw coca as a spirit, Europe in the 19th century saw it as a puzzle. The timing was perfect and dangerous. This was the age when laboratories felt a bit like temples of a new faith. The faith that everything in nature could be taken apart, named, weighed, and repackaged. Chemists had already pulled morphine out of opium, caffeine out of coffee beans, quinine out of cinchona bark. Each success carried the same thrill. Find the one invisible molecule responsible for a plant's power, purify it, and you had something you could bottle, dose, and sell. When coca leaves arrived, they were just the next mystery on the shelf. Imagine a quiet university lab, wooden benches, glass flasks, the sharp smell of solvents. A young chemist opens a crate from South America. Inside, pressed rows of brittle green leaves, labeled from distant valleys he has never seen. They look dull, dry. They've been dead for weeks. There's nothing obviously mystical about them now. No priests, no mountains, no whispered prayers. Just plant matter and curiosity. The process of extraction is slow, repetitive, and oddly intimate. Grind the leaves, soak them in one liquid, filter, evaporate, repeat with another solvent. Try not to inhale too much of anything. The first attempts don't work well. The residue is crude, impure, brownish, more mud than miracle. But science in that era had a kind of stubborn optimism. If the first method failed, you changed the recipe and tried again and again. Eventually, a different sort of residue appears. Not sticky, not muddy, but crystalline, white, bitter, a substance that, at first glance, looks like nothing at all. Just another powder in a lab already full of powders. One of the chemists, Albert Niemann in Germany, does something that by modern standards feels reckless, but at the time was almost normal. He tastes it, not a spoonful, not a dose, just a few grains on the tongue. Immediately, one odd thing happens. His tongue goes numb, not in the fuzzy, tingly way of a mint or a spice. Dead, anesthetized. The powder has turned a piece of his body into silent stone. That single sensation is like a bell ringing in his mind. This isn't just a stimulant hiding in a leaf. It's something that can switch off pain. He writes it down. He measures. He repeats. Bits of data begin to gather on the page. How it dissolves, how it crystallizes, what temperature it reacts at, how it interacts with acids and bases. He gives it a name built from the plant's genus and the chemical suffix of his time, cocaine. If the Andes had named the plant like a goddess, Europe gave its distilled spirit a name like a file in a cabinet. And then something surprising happens. Nothing much happens for a while. The discovery sits mostly in academic articles that few outside the scientific community read. A handful of researchers order samples. A few doctors experiment with it here and there. But there is no immediate explosion, no instant global trend. It's almost as if someone has quietly invented fire, then left it in a drawer while the rest of the house goes on using candles. The match that finally lights the room doesn't strike in a lab. It strikes in the mind of a businessman. Picture Paris in the 1860s. Gas lamps glow along the boulevards. Carriages rattle past cafes, where writers and politicians argue over coffee and wine. Electricity is still a rumor. Psychology is still in its infancy. But one thing everyone already knows how to talk about is exhaustion. Urban life is speeding up. Factory workers endure long shifts. Bureaucrats spend hours over paperwork. Artists drink and smoke themselves into frayed nerves. Nerves becomes a fashionable complaint. Everything is blamed on them. Sleeplessness, sadness, headaches, lack of energy. Into this environment steps Angelo Mariani, a Corsican who understands something many scientists don't. It's not enough to discover a substance. You have to tell a story about it. He looks at coca and doesn't see a remote Andean ritual. He sees branding potential. He takes high-quality Bordeaux wine, respectable, already trusted, and infuses it with coca leaves. The alcohol acts like a solvent, pulling the cocaine out gently, like steeping tea in reverse. The result is a deep, rich liquid that tastes like wine but carries something extra, a subtle lift, a brightening of mood, a sense of being a little sharper, a little more alive. Mariani gives it a name that sounds almost like a person, Vin Mariani. But the real magic isn't in the bottle. It's in how he convinces people to drink it. He sends complimentary cases to people whose names can move other people's hands. Writers, actors, doctors, even religious figures. Along with the bottles, he sends a simple question. How do you feel? And they answer. Letters come back praising the tonic. It cured their fatigue. It soothed their melancholy. It gave them strength to work late into the night. Some replies come from truly astonishing corners. A pope praises the drink. So, members of royal families compliment its effects. Inventors and composers credit it with. Mariani collects these responses like treasure. Then he does something new for his time. He prints them. Advertisements start appearing with glowing testimonials. Portraits of famous faces next to quotes about this miraculous wine infused with a mysterious South American leaf. It's the 19th century version of influencer marketing, except the influencers here are heads of state, religious leaders, and cultural giants. The public looks up at posters and page ads and sees a simple equation. If they drink it, and they are brilliant, holy, successful, tireless, maybe this bottle is a shortcut to becoming a little more like them. Behind each label is a quiet global network. Coca leaves harvested on high slopes by poor farmers. Bales packed and shipped through coastal ports. Factories in Europe where leaves are steeped in vats of wine. Crates of bottled tonic sent by rail and ship to pharmacies and cafes. The leaf that once lived in the cheek of a shepherd now lives in heavy green glass, sitting behind polished counters under gas lamps. Right about this time, on the other side of the Atlantic, another man watches. In Atlanta, a wounded Civil War veteran named John Pemberton struggles with chronic pain and morphine dependence. He's a pharmacist. He knows tonics. He knows trends. When he hears about coca wine in Europe and its success, he recognizes an opportunity. Maybe for profit, maybe for self-rescue, maybe both. He creates his own version, a wine infused with coca and cola nut for caffeine, promising vigor, relief, and mental clarity. It sells well enough. Then, local politics throw a plot twist he could never have scripted. Prohibition laws. Suddenly, alcoholic tonics are under threat. The wine in coca wine becomes a liability. Pemberton does what desperate, creative people often do. He improvises. He removes the alcohol, keeps the coca, keeps the cola, adds sugar, adds carbonation. The result is sweet, fizzy, and strangely energizing. He sells it not as a medicine in a bottle, but as a fountain drink, a glass at a time, served over ice, marketed as a health beverage. People step up to marble counters, pay a few cents, and sip something whose true pharmacology they do not remotely understand. In their mouths, it's just pleasant. In their brains, a more complex story is unfolding. Caffeine and cocaine holding hands, whispering to nerves and neurotransmitters. The drink gets a name that nods to both its key ingredients. Coca, cola, Coca-Cola. In that moment, something quietly astonishing has happened. The same plant that miners once chewed to survive 10-hour shifts underground is now helping sell harmless-looking glasses of brown, bubbly refreshment to office workers and families on a hot day. The same alkaloid that priests once worried might block salvation is now poured over ice with a smile, backed by newspaper ads. Science has done its part. It isolated the active ingredient, proved its effects, measured its strengths. Commerce has done its part. It wrapped that ingredient in glass and sugar and respectability and placed it into the daily lives of people who never heard of Mama Coca or Cerro Rico. And somewhere in between, the original leaf, with all its ritual, all its caution, all its whispers to the mountains, has been almost completely edited out of the story. Instead, there is a polite new narrative. This drink gives you energy. This tonic lifts your spirits. This preparation is modern, scientific, safe. No one is yet asking the question that hindsight makes obvious. What happens when a substance born in the thin air of the Andes, shaped by scarcity and ritual, is turned into a casual daily habit for millions? That answer is still in the future. For now, the bottles sell, the glasses clink, the advertisements bloom, and the white crystals sitting in small glass vials in laboratories are about to leave the controlled world of pharmacists and chemists and move into the hands of another profession entirely: doctors, psychiatrists, and a young neurologist in Vienna who believes he may have just found a cure for sadness itself. By the time the 19th century slid toward its final decades, cocaine had already slipped quietly into wine bottles, soda fountains, and tonic jars. But it was about to take on a new and far more dangerous costume, that of the scientific miracle. In the late 1800s, medicine was desperate for heroes. Surgeons had just begun to wash their hands. Anesthesia existed, but it was crude and terrifying. Ether and chloroform, clouds of gas that could knock you unconscious or stop your heart, sometimes both. Dentistry was torture with better tools. Eye surgery was a kind of organized agony. Doctors were starving for something that could kill pain without plunging the patient into the dark ocean of unconsciousness. Into this hunger stepped a substance extracted from a leaf most Europeans had never seen growing on a hillside: cocaine. At first, it lived in tiny, dignified vials, sitting quietly in pharmacies, behind counters, and on doctors' desks. To the general public, it was mostly invisible. To young physicians looking for a breakthrough, it glowed like a small white star. One of them was a young neurologist in Vienna, not yet the founder of psychoanalysis, not yet a name every psychology student would learn. Just a man in a small room with debts, ambition, and a brain that refused to settle for an ordinary career: Sigmund Freud. Freud had heard whispers from German colleagues about this South American alkaloid. They said it chased away fatigue, sharpened thought, and lifted the spirits without, supposedly, any serious downside. He was restless, prone to gloom, and more than a little captivated by the idea of a pharmacological key that might unlock the mind's mysteries, or at least cheer him up. So he did what many doctors of his time did, without much hesitation. He tried it on himself. Imagine him late at night, lamp lit, the streets of Vienna quiet outside his window. He dips a small amount of white powder onto his tongue, waits, and listens to his own nervous system like a scientist and a patient at once. The first impression is thrilling. The world seems brighter. Thoughts come more easily, not in a frantic rush, but in a confident, controlled flow. He feels awake, buoyant. His mood lifts like a curtain has been pulled back from a window. He is not knocked out, not dulled. He is more himself, or so it feels. Freud, careful but excited, begins to write. He publishes a paper with a simple, almost affectionate title: Über Coca, on Coca. In it, he praises cocaine in language that borders on the rapturous. He calls it a remedy for fatigue, sadness, even for some forms of addiction. He suggests soldiers, workers, and patients might all benefit. He gives it to friends. He recommends it to colleagues. He suggests it to his fiancée to improve her mood and energy, envisioning rosy cheeks and a cheerful disposition. It's easy now to shake our heads at this, but in his era, he is not a rogue dealer. He is a respected scientist championing what seems like a clean, modern tool. His enthusiasm does something even more powerful than any advertisement. it gives cocaine intellectual legitimacy. If a serious doctor in Vienna recommends it, how bad can it be? Somewhere else in Europe, another young doctor is watching. Karl Kohler, an ophthalmologist, has read about cocaine's numbing effect on the tongue. He has a simple, radical thought. If it can numb the tongue, can it numb the eye? Eye surgery, at this time, is a delicate nightmare. Patients must be held down. The slightest flinch can turn a necessary procedure into a disaster. Kohler begins experimenting, first on animals, then eventually on He dissolves cocaine in a solution and drips it carefully into the surface of the eye. The patient blinks, then waits. He touches the eye with a delicate instrument. No flinch, no cry of pain. He cuts delicately. The patient feels nothing. It's as if someone has pressed mute on the nerves in that one small patch of the body, while leaving the rest of the person awake and conscious. In 1884, Kohler presents his findings to a room of colleagues. It's one of those quiet revolutions that doesn't look like much from the outside, but inside the profession, it's an earthquake. Suddenly, all kinds of procedures become easier, safer. Eye surgeries, dental operations, minor surgical repairs. Cocaine, diluted and applied locally, looks like a pure gift. Not a demon, not a vice, but a tool. Precise, controllable, scientific. Pharmaceutical companies notice. One American firm, Park Davis, begins to market cocaine in almost every form you can imagine. Small vials of powder, injectable solutions, cigarettes, even throat lozenges for singers and speakers. Advertisements speak solemnly of relief from exhaustion, cure for nervousness, tonics for shy, withdrawn children. A parent could go to a pharmacy with a restless child, walk out with a respectable, doctor-recommended preparation, and have no idea that they were dosing their son or daughter with the same alkaloid minors once chewed before descending into potasy. There is a strange innocence to this period. People aren't hiding cocaine in alleyways yet. They are prescribing it, gifting it, sharing it at parties as a kind of scientific marvel. The same white powder that will one day be passed under nightclub tables is now handed across polished counters with a pharmacist's calm nod. For a few years, it seems like the story might stabilize there. A happy ending. A plant from the Andes, purified by European science, turned into a boon for surgery and psychiatry, and supervised by educated professionals. But hidden inside that happy narrative, another story is quietly coiling. It begins, as such stories often do, with a single patient. One of Freud's close friends, Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, is a brilliant physiologist with a terrible problem. He's addicted to morphine after a severe injury. Freud, convinced of cocaine's promise, believes he has a solution. If cocaine uplifts mood and seems non-addictive, perhaps it can help his friend break free from morphine. He prescribes it enthusiastically. At first, the result looks promising. Fleischl feels better, seems more present, less consumed by the heavy fog of opiates. But gradually, the balance shifts. What was meant to be a ladder out of one pit becomes a staircase into another. Fleischl begins to crave cocaine. He increases his doses. He chases the clarity, the energy, the sense of being okay. The line between remedy and need dissolves. His nights splinter into fragments of restless wakefulness. His mind, once clear, grows crowded with shapes and sounds that no one else can see or hear. He feels insects crawling under his skin, not real ones, but an hallucination that will one day become infamous as cocaine bugs. Paranoia creeps in. The world around him twists into menace. What had been promised as medicine has become a tormentor. Before long, he is trapped in a new addiction, stacked on top of the old one. a morphine-dependent man now also enslaved to cocaine. His decline horrifies those around him. For Freud, it is personal and devastating. The drug he praised in print, recommended to colleagues, and gave to a dear friend has partly destroyed that friend's mind and life. Freud quietly stops advocating for cocaine. He moves on to other theories, other tools. In later years, he speaks of this chapter rarely and with visible discomfort. But the powder does not move on. It stays. It sits in pharmacy drawers, is stirred into patent medicines, is injected into gums, is sprinkled into cigarettes. Doctors begin to notice a pattern creeping into their case notes. Patients who were prescribed cocaine for depression or fatigue are returning with stranger complaints: inability to sleep without it, panic, obsessive use, hallucinations, and a relentless compulsion to take just a little more. The miracle drug has a quiet, cruel qualification. It works beautifully until it doesn't. And by the time it stops working, the person using it may not remember what life was like without it. Medical journals, once full of glowing reports, start to publish words like habituation and dependence. A few brave physicians call. But outside that small circle of experts, the image lingers. Cocaine as modern, clean, approved, sophisticated. Respectable journals and pharmaceutical catalogs are slow to admit their mistake. They had, after all, helped build the illusion. In the gap between early enthusiasm and growing unease, millions of doses are sold. Powder touches tongues and gums and veins. Doctors reassure. Patients trust. It will take scandal, sensational news stories, and something even darker: the collision of cocaine with racial politics and fear. Before the public fully turns on the white powder they once welcomed into their medicine cabinets. For now, at the end of this chapter, cocaine stands on a strange threshold. Not yet the feared back-alley drug, no longer an entirely unchallenged miracle, still widely sold, still widely praised, its shadow beginning to lengthen. The leaf that helped people breathe at altitude has become a crystal that can silence pain, lift mood, and if used too long, whisper madness into the brain. The world has lit a powerful candle. Only slowly is it beginning to see how easily that light can set everything else on fire. When the law finally slammed the pharmacy drawer on cocaine, the story could have ended there. The white powder had been labeled, taxed, restricted. Doctors were warned, companies adjusted their formulas, and the miracle drug was quietly escorted out of the daylight. But cocaine is a substance that thrives in shadows. When you push it out the front door, it doesn't vanish. It changes its clothes and slips in through the side entrance. The United States in the early 20th century was already full of crackling tension. You had industrial cities booming with steel and smoke, new machines, new money, new anxieties. On the surface, there was talk of order, morality, progress. Underneath, there was a different pulse: restlessness, boredom, ambition, and a very old human desire to feel something more than just another long day. The Harrison Narcotics Act and similar laws didn't kill that desire. They just told it, "You are now illegal." That's where prohibition logic always trips over itself. You can outlaw a substance. You cannot outlaw the feelings that made people reach for it. In the 1920s, the United States did something bold and, in retrospect, almost absurd. It tried to ban alcohol. Overnight, something that had been ordinary, a glass of beer after work, a whiskey in a bar, became contraband. But human beings are stubbornly creative when someone tells them, you can't. In cities, doors that used to lead to storage rooms and basements quietly turned into portals to another world. Speakeasies. You didn't just walk in. You needed to know the right knock, the right name, the right person at the door. Behind those doors, the country's respectable face came off. Jazz bands crowded onto tiny stages. Trumpets bent notes into the early hours. Women with bobbed hair and bare arms danced in ways their grandparents would have whispered about in scandalized tones. Men in good suits took off their hats and their inhibitions at the same time. Alcohol was the price of admission. It was what people came for. Cocaine was what some of them stayed for. It didn't arrive with fanfare. It came in whispers. A small vial passed hand to hand. A discreet offer in a dark booth. Want something stronger? Not stronger in the knocks you out sense. Stronger in the keeps you going sense. At first, it wasn't for everyone. That became part of the appeal. You could buy a drink if you had the right address. But cocaine? You needed the right circle. It became a secret layer on top of an already secret world. The jazz age was all about speed, not cars or trains, but the velocity of life itself. You worked all day, you partied all night, you fell into bed for a few hours, you did it again. A line of cocaine made that pattern feel sustainable, even when the body quietly disagreed. The powder was perfectly suited to this R. Unlike opiates, it didn't drag you downward. Unlike alcohol, it didn't blur the edges, it sharpened them. Your wit felt quicker, your conversation brighter, the music somehow clearer and more urgent. Of course, that was the story it told your brain. It left out the fine print. Organized crime, already busy shipping illegal liquor by truck and boat, noticed that some of their best customers were willing to pay very good money for something smaller, lighter, and far more profitable per ounce. For mob bosses who fought in columns of numbers, cocaine made elegant sense. A crate of whiskey took space, fuel, and muscle. A small, carefully wrapped package of powder fit in a coat pocket. You could hide cocaine in wall panels, smuggle it in luggage, tuck it into lining and hollow objects. It was quite literally easier to move than the money you made from selling it. Figures like Arnold Rothstein, the sort of man who could allegedly fix a World Series and still find time to run gambling and smuggling enterprises, understood that drugs were just another line of business in a diversified portfolio of vice. The details varied, but the basic shape was clear. Import from overseas, cut the product, move it discreetly through trusted hands, sell it to the kind of people who would never call the police if something went wrong. In that era, those people were less likely to be slum dwellers and more likely to be, well, important. Bankers, stockbrokers, entertainers, politicians who preached one thing in public and snorted another in private. Cocaine became a luxury item, like a tailored suit or a custom cigarette case. Not necessary for survival, but potent as a symbol. If you had access to it, it meant you were inside some inner circle. Hollywood, still in its silent film phase, absorbed this pattern with almost ear. On screen, actors glowed. Off screen, they were staggeringly human. Studio contracts were iron cages disguised as opportunity. You were expected to be beautiful, tireless, charming, even when your body was cracking under the strain. Long days, reshoots, publicity tours, endless rounds of dinners and appearances. Cocaine whispered a seductive half-truth. You don't have to slow down. A tired actor with another scene under hot lights. A director struggling to stay sharp after 18 hours awake. A publicist trying to keep a dozen anxious, fragile egos in the air at once. The powder turned up in dressing rooms, at private parties in canyon mansions, in the back rooms of hotels. The studios knew, of course. They knew more than they ever admitted. Every overdose, every breakdown, every mysterious exhaustion that forced a promising starlet off the screen was a risk to the bottom line, so they perfected a talent Hollywood never quite lost: damage control. Quiet hospital stays, carefully crafted statements, studio-paid doctors with loose ethics and tight lips. Cocaine was allowed to exist as long as it remained invisible to the ticket-buying public. The same rule applied, in a different costume, to the artists and intellectuals in New York, Paris, Berlin. These bohemian circles liked to imagine themselves as separate from both the stiff respectability of upper-class society and the crude greed of gangsters. They were seeking something else: truth, meaning, a glimpse behind the curtain of ordinary perception. If you already believed that the world was made of illusions, that reality needed to be poked and prodded. A drug that promised enhanced perception was dangerously easy to romanticize. Writers stayed up through the night, pages piling beside them, convinced that the racing thoughts were pure inspiration. Painters scribbled furiously, lines and colors spilling onto canvas, feeling that some inner barrier had finally broken. Cocaine loved this illusion. It made you feel intensely alive, so of course you believed that what you were creating in that state was the very core of your genius. Sometimes, pieces created in such storms were brilliant. Often, they were not. But cocaine didn't care. Its mission was not to improve art. Its mission was to make your nervous system want more of it. The powder had, by now, achieved a curious double life. To the public, especially in rural and conservative areas, drugs meant opium dens in foreign ports, or the occasional scandal whispered about in big cities. To certain circles, the wealthy, the famous, the daring, cocaine was a private ritual. People didn't advertise their use, but they also didn't always perceive themselves as addicts. The language they used was softer. I party sometimes. I use it too. The risk seemed manageable, especially when you could afford good clothes, clean surroundings, and doctors who would call your condition overwork instead of naming the line on your mirror. Yet beneath the glamour, the same old patterns were slowly weaving themselves. Tolerance creeping upward, moods whipsawing between confidence and paranoia, relationships fraying, bodies quietly paying the price. Cocaine had left the pharmacy counter. It now lived in speakeasies behind unmarked doors, in green rooms and private clubs, in the pockets of those who considered themselves above the ordinary rules. It had traded its white coat for a tuxedo. It wore jazz and evening gowns, cigar smoke, and gold cufflinks. But chemically, it was unchanged. The same molecule that once sat in a surgeon's vial, the same alkaloid that helped an Inca runner cross a mountain pass, was now powering the dance floors and deal tables of a world that thought it had reinvented itself from the ground up. The transformation was subtle but critical. Cocaine was no longer a medicine for the masses. It was becoming a marker of status. And just like any status symbol in a society obsessed with appearances, it would not stay in the back rooms forever. Soon, it would step into the spotlight, not as an elegant secret, but as a public scandal. Because while the elite were snorting it on glass tables, another, harsher form of the same substance was preparing to explode in neighborhoods that had never once seen the inside of a speakeasy. For most of its life, coca was stubbornly local. It grew on steep hillsides. It traveled in woven pouches. It lived between the teeth and cheek of shepherds, porters, miners, and priests. Even when the Spanish twisted it into fuel for the silver mines, the leaf itself stayed close to the mountains that birthed it. To become truly global, coca needed one thing it had never had before: an industry, not a ritual, not a habit, not a medicine, a system, a chain, a product designed to leave. The transformation begins far from the polished tables where cocaine will eventually be served, and far from the white tiles of any laboratory. It starts in a clearing in the jungle. If you arrive there at dawn, it doesn't look like the beginning of a multinational business. A few wood huts, smoke rising from cooking fires, children chasing each other between rows of low, dark green bushes. The coca plants are unremarkable. Waist-high shrubs, their leaves glossy and oval, arranged in neat patterns on land that was once forest. The people who tend them are not villains or masterminds. They are farmers trapped in a particular equation. Coffee prices fall. Maize is hard to transport. The soil is poor and the road to market is worse. Coca, though, coca always has a buyer. They harvest the leaves by hand, fingers quick and practiced. Sacks fill slowly, the weight creeping up one leaf at a time. When you ask a grower what happens next, many will shrug. The buyers come, they say. They take it away. Somewhere beyond their fields, the plant passes into someone else's story. Follow one of the buyers, and you leave the ordered rows of the plantation for a more secret landscape. A narrow path, a stream crossed on wobbling planks. The air grows heavier, soaked with the smell of rotting vegetation and fuel. At the end of the path, you find it, the jungle lab. The word lab might make you picture stainless steel and white coats. What you see instead is something improvised and brutal. A pit lined with plastic sheets, rusting oil drums on their sides, barrels with faded labels for gasoline, kerosene, solvents, torn sacks of cement or lime stacked against a wall. Someone drags a sack of fresh leaves forward and dumps them into the pit. Men in rubber boots, and sometimes barefoot, climb in after them. They stomp the leaves down like grapes, but the liquid here is not juice. It's fuel. Gasoline and kerosene soak the mass, pulling the alkaloids out of the leaf veins, transforming the gentle green into a toxic slurry. The process that follows has been refined over decades, but its logic is simple. Add chemicals that separate. Add others that bind. Force the important molecule to gather together and leave everything else behind. Sulfuric acid to push things into solution. Lime or cement to push others out. Stir, settle, drain, repeat. The leaves that once slipped quietly into the mouths of Andean workers are now pulped, soaked, dissolved, and discarded as waste. In the end, what's pulled from the pit is not powder yet, just a coarse off-white paste, sticky, harsh-smelling, packed into bricks. Pasta basica, coca paste. This is the first decisive cut between plant and product. The paste is not sacred. No one offers it to the earth. No one prays over it. It's cargo, smaller, stronger, easier to move than leaves. A kilo of paste represents a hillside of plants, collapsed into something you can hide in a sack or under a tarp. From the jungle clearings of Peru and Bolivia, this paste begins to move. Mules carry it along narrow mountain paths, their hooves kicking stones into ravines. Pickup trucks with false bottoms bounce along dirt roads. Rivers carry crude boats with hidden. The destination in the mid-20th century is often not Colombia. It is Chile. In coastal cities like Valparaiso and Santiago, a different class of trafficker is waiting. They don't live in shacks in the forest. They own small businesses, restaurants, bars, import warehouses. They dress well, pay bribes, know rich officials like witch favors. At the center of one of these early networks is a woman who will become known simply as the Godmother. Her restaurant serves regular customers by day. By night, in back rooms and basements, another menu is being managed. She is not a chemist. What she understands is flow. Paste goes in. Money and refined product come about. To make that happen, she needs people with a different skill set, chemists. Some are self-taught tinkerers. Others have real training. All of them work in spaces that no safety inspector would approve. Hidden labs in industrial outskirts, remote farmhouses, suburban garages that nev. They take the coca paste and subject it to a second, more meticulous baptism: ether, acetone, ammonia, acids. Wash, dissolve, precipitate, filter, dry. Each wash strips away another layer of contamination: plant fibers, fuel residue, byproducts of the jungle process. The paste transforms step by step into fine, white crystals, cocaine hydrochloride. This is the form the world will learn to recognize. Bitter on the tongue, easily dissolved, easily sniffed, easy to cut, package, and price. In these Chilean labs, something subtle but huge is happening. Cocaine is no longer being produced for local use, or even just for scattered foreign enthusiasts. It is being manufactured for export. Like copper, fruit, or fish meal, it becomes a commodity in a country's clandestine trade balance. To get it north, the traffickers use cleverness instead of brute force. They dissolve the cocaine into other substances, embed it in plastics, hide it. Mules carry small amounts on commercial flights, suitcases with false bottoms, swallowed pellets. Bigger loads move in the holds of cargo ships, tucked into containers or concealed inside legitimate goods. Each successful run proves the system works. Each profit is reinvested. Better labs, more reliable transport, more people on the payroll in airports and customs. For a moment, the Chilean connection looks like the future of the trade. Then, politics intervenes. In 1973, a military coup tears through Chile. The new regime is harsh, paranoid, and obsessed with control. Independent criminal networks, especially ones tied to international smuggling, suddenly look less like clever side hustles and more like potential threats. Raids follow. Some labs are dismantled. Some traffickers are killed, imprisoned, or driven into exile. The pipeline shudders, but demand does not. In the United States and Europe, interest in cocaine is rising. Movie stars sniff it in bathroom stalls. Musicians use it to fuel tours. Wealthy clients in New York, Miami, and Los Angeles start to see it as the perfect drug for long nights and longer workdays. So the question becomes, if Chile is no longer safe as the main refinery and hub, where do you move the operation? Look north on the map, past the Atacama, across Peru, into a country whose name will, for decades, be shadowed by one product: Colombia. Colombia has everything the trade needs. Vast rural regions the state barely reaches, coastlines on both the Pacific and the Caribbean, a history of contraband and smuggling, and deep economic inequality. Ambitious men in cities like Medellin and Cali study the example of Chile and decide to do more than copy it. They decide to scale it. Where the Chilean network stitched together paste, labs, and routes, the emerging Colombian groups want to control all of it. Finance coca cultivation in neighboring countries, run their own jungle labs to make paste, build larger, more sophisticated refineries to make pure cocaine, own airstrips, planes, and boats, negotiate directly with distributors in the United States and Europe. In corporate language, this is vertical integration. In their language, it's simply good sense. Deep in the Colombian jungle, super labs appear. These are not a few barrels in a shed. They're full-scale chemical factories hiding in green. Rows of drums, generators chugging through the night, dormitories for workers, kitchens, storage for fuel and precursors, guarded perimeters patrolled by armed men. From above, the forest seems unbroken. From the ground, The trees part to reveal the quiet, beating heart of a billion-dollar industry. Planes land on dirt strips, cut into the bush, load up bricks of wrapped cocaine, and lift off for the next link in the chain. The farmers at the beginning of this process still live in small houses, still count their money in worn notes. But somewhere up the line, the numbers have become surreal. Tons of product per month, tens, then hundreds of millions of dollars per year. Assets, ranches, buildings, planes, ships, paid for in cash and registered under false names. Coca is no longer a plant woven into daily survival. It is now the raw material of a hidden export economy. On paper, a government might say its main exports are coffee, oil, flowers. Off the record, everyone knows there is another river flowing out. Fine white crystals that began as leaves on a hillside. Once that river starts, it doesn't just carry money. It carries something else downstream. Power. The men who sit at the center of this new cocaine export business will use that power to reshape their cities, their politics, and the meaning of fear itself. And at the front of that wave is a name the whole world will soon learn to pronounce and associate forever with the powder that turned a leaf into an empire. By the late 1970s, America had changed costumes again. The tie-dye of the 1960s was fading. The peace signs and protest posters were curling at the corners. The dream of dropping out had quietly given way to a different fantasy. Not escape, but ascent. Not turn on, tune in, drop out, but work harder, climb higher, stand out. The country was moving into an era with a new slogan, never officially printed, but deeply believed. If you're not winning, you're losing. Skyscrapers rose like glass trophies over Manhattan. Wall Street trading floors roared with the sound of phones and shouted orders. Magazines put men in tailored suits and women in power blazers on their covers and called them a new species, yuppies, young urban professionals. The heroes of this moment were not mystics or poets. They were dealmakers, and somewhere in that world, cocaine found its perfect habitat. It had already been a secret luxury for the rich, a hidden vice for artists, but now it became something more specific. The performance drug for people who believed they were born to win. In the 1960s, the drugs of choice had been about getting away from the system. Marijuana, LSD, psilocybin, substances that made you stare at the stars, question authority, see the universe as one. Cocaine was the opposite of that. It didn't ask you to doubt capitalism. It offered to help you outrun everyone else inside it. Imagine a young broker on Wall Street in 1983. He wakes up in a small but expensive apartment, puts on a sharp suit, ties a silk tie he cannot really afford yet, and rides the elevator down feeling slightly behind. Everyone seems to be moving faster than him. Closing bigger deals, getting better bonuses, dating more beautiful people, somehow managing to be in 3 places at once. Then one night, at a bar filled with other ambitious faces, someone he admires leans over and says quietly, "Try this, it helps." They don't call it a drug. They call it a pick-me-up, a boost, a way to stay sharp. In the cramped bathroom, under 2 bright fluorescent lights, he bends over a polished counter. A line of white powder waits, neat, precise, like a little path. He inhales. The burn in his nose is sharp, but brief. Then comes the rush. Not a hallucination, not a trip, just a sudden certainty. He feels taller without growing, smarter without learning, more charming without changing a single word. On the trading floor the next day, his jokes land better, his fear is quieter. His thoughts seem to stack in perfect rows, ready for use. It's easy, from the outside, to call this delusion. From inside his skin, it feels like he has finally caught up to the version of himself he was always supposed to be. This is how cocaine sells itself in the 1980s, not as an escape from your life, but as an upgrade. The same pattern spreads through other realms of success. In Los Angeles, producers sit in dim screening rooms, watching rough cuts of movies that could flop or become global hits. They have meetings, lunches, more meetings, endless negotiations. They sleep little, age quickly, and convince themselves that the right deal is always one drink and one phone call away. Cocaine whispers to them, "You can do one more meeting. You can stay up a little later. You can be a little more persuasive." Rock stars on tour, nights in hotels, planes, limos, identical dressing rooms, face a different problem: exhaustion disguised as glamour. They step onto stage under blinding lights, expected to be pure electricity for thousands of people who have paid to see that version of them, not the version who just wants to lie down. A line before the show. Another between. It's all part of the same story. Cocaine tells high-achieving people that the laws of the body are negotiable. Nowhere did this fantasy glow brighter than at a famous club in New York City, Studio 54. On the outside, just a building. On the inside, an ecosystem. If Wall Street was where money proved itself, Studio 54 was where it danced. Behind the velvet ropes, the rules of the city melted. Movie stars mingled with fashion designers, politicians, models, rock stars, socialites, and people whose only visible talent was knowing how to be in the right place at the right time. The club's logo, a stylized crescent moon with a little spoon to its nose, was a joke that wasn't really a joke. Cocaine was not just present there. It was part of the club's aesthetic. Waiters carried drinks. Other hands carried small vials. Bumps were taken in bathrooms, booths, stairwells, even in corners of the dance floor where the lights didn't quite reach. It wasn't a shameful secret. It was more like a high-status habit. If you were spotted using cocaine in Studio 54, it didn't mark you as a junkie. It marked you as someone who truly belonged in that compressed universe of excess. The paraphernalia became its own little fashion statement. Gold or silver razor blades for chopping lines, tiny spoons worn as jewelry, mirrored compacts, elegant glass vials, not medical, not street, designer. In magazines, music, and movies, references to snow, white lines, blow, riding the white horse, slid into lyrics and dialogue. Even when the stories were, on the surface, warnings, like Scarface, with its mountain of cocaine and its blood-soaked ending, the visuals were mesmerizing. Palaces built from drug money, tigers kept as pets, suits, cars, and skyscrapers glowing with dirty luxury. The cautionary part of the tale often landed softer than the spectacle. A young viewer could watch the final scene where everything collapses and still walk away thinking, "Yes, but did you see the house?" Cocaine fed on that selective attention. It allowed people to see the highlight reel and blur the parts where noses bled, hearts raced, and paranoia crept in. And underneath the glamour, something more mechanical was happening. Cocaine is not a long-lasting drug. The peak is short, a burst of euphoria, focus, confidence. Then comes the plateau, followed by a drop. For someone trying to close deals, work long nights, perform on stage, or stay charming at every party, that drop feels like a betrayal. There are two main ways to respond. Decide it's not worth it. Walk away. Take another line. The second choice is, of course, good business for those selling it. What looks at first like an occasional performance enhancer quietly reorganizes a person's schedule. They don't admit they're planning their day around the drug, but certain patterns emerge. One before a big meeting, one after work to stay sharp, one before going out, one to keep the night going, one more because the last one didn't hit quite as hard. Meanwhile, the body adapts. The rush becomes less dramatic, the come down more pronounced. The stable, confident winner image that cocaine helped create begins to crack at the edges. Sleeplessness, anxiety, irritability, a creeping suspicion that people are talking behind your back, moments of racing heart and cold sweating that you call stress because you don't want to call them what they really are. On the outside, the 1980s often presented a sharp, crisp silhouette, sharp suits, sharp deals, sharp lines, both in tailoring and on mirrors. On the inside, a lot of people were fraying. But the myth of cocaine as the successful person's drug was so strong that many users refused to say. Addicts, in their minds, were people on grimy street corners, people with needles, people whose lives were obviously falling apart. They were not that. They had jobs, cars, homes, invitations. They told themselves they were just using to keep up. The tragic twist is that while this white-collar, high-status consumption was exploding, chemistry and street economics were preparing a cheap, smokable, devastating cousin of the same drug. One that would hit neighborhoods without stock options or private clubs. Two worlds, same molecule, very different stories. In penthouse apartments and VIP rooms, cocaine was still the powder of winners, the drug that whispered, "You are supposed to be at the center of all this. You deserve this speed. You deserve this energy. You are built for this." The bill for that illusion would arrive later, in rehab centers, divorce courts, emergency rooms, and in a very different kind of war declared not on the ambitious and the wealthy, but on the people at the bottom, who ended up inhaling cocaine's cheaper, harsher echo. By the early 1980s, cocaine had found its way into boardrooms, nightclubs, tour buses, and private jets. It was expensive, powdered, and, at least in the public imagination, very far from the lives of people counting coins for bus fare. Then the chemistry changed, just a little, and that tiny change tore through entire neighborhoods like a bomb. At first glance, it doesn't look like much of a breakthrough. No new molecule, no secret lab, no brilliant chemist in a white coat. Just a kitchen stove, a spoon, some water, a box of baking soda, and powdered cocaine. For dealers and users, cocaine hydrochloride, the standard white powder, had two main problems. It was too expensive for the poorest customers. When snorted, it was too slow and not intense enough for people chasing bigger, sharper sensations. Then someone found a simpler trick. Take your powdered cocaine, dissolve it in water, add a pinch of baking soda or another household base, heat it gently. As the mixture bubbles, a different form of cocaine separates out. The base, little solid chunks that float, then harden as the water evaporates. When the pan cools, you're left with small, waxy, yellowish-white nuggets. They make a faint crackling sound when heated. That sound gives them their name, crack. Chemically, this is not a brand new substance. It's cocaine in a different form. But pharmacologically, practically, socially, it's a whole new creature. The first crucial difference is how it gets into the body. Powdered cocaine is usually snorted. The drug seeps through the nasal tissues into the bloodstream, then up to the brain. Fast, but not instant. Crack is smoked. The rock is heated in a glass pipe, on foil, in makeshift devices cobbled together from cans or bottles. The smoke goes straight into the lungs, which are lined with an enormous surface area of delicate tissue designed to exchange gases efficiently. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. Now, cocaine in. From lung to blood to brain in seconds. The result is a high that doesn't sneak up on you. It hits. Users describe it in extreme language because normal adjectives feel too small. A tidal wave, a lightning strike, 5 minutes of being bigger than everything. The rush is full body, warm rush through the chest. Intense euphoria. A dizzying surge of energy and confidence. A sense that every sensation is brighter and closer. If snorting cocaine is like turning up the volume, smoking crack is like standing inside the speaker. But then comes the design flaw written into its chemistry. The peak doesn't last. After a few minutes, maybe 10 at most, the rocket starts falling back to Earth. The world that felt magnificent 5 minutes ago now looks flat, gray, wrong. Anxiety seeps in. Irritability sharpens. The body screams for the feeling again. Craving isn't a vague would-be nice. It's a sudden, clawing need. In this lopsided bargain, crack offers a tiny burst of heaven, followed by a long drop into a newly deepened hell. And unlike some other drugs that take months or years to forge chains, crack's cycle of soaring and crashing can begin to hook people in days. Then comes the other half of the disaster, price. In the mid-1980s, a gram of powdered cocaine might cost around $100 on the street. That's a nightclub budget, a lawyer's budget, a dealer's budget, not a broke teenager's budget. But that same gram could be cooked into multiple small rocks. Each rock could be sold for just a few dollars, $5, sometimes less. Suddenly, the drug that had been the accessory of lawyers and stockbrokers had a new, cheap form that could fit into a or neighborhoods already dealing with unemployment, crumbling housing, and neglect became perfect markets from a dealer's perspective. High density, limited opportunities, and a lot of people with time to kill and pain to numb. In cities like New York, Los Angeles, Detroit, Miami, Washington, D.C., a new urban landscape began to appear. A corner that used to host kids playing or an old man sweeping his stoop was now a 24-hour, open-air marketplace. Look closer. Men and boys posted at each end of the block as lookouts. Runners moving rocks from stash to customer. Older figures watching from a car or a doorway, counting. Money flows one way. Crack flows the other. The economy rearranges itself around this new product. Young men, locked out of legitimate jobs, see fast cash for the first time in their lives. In a week, a teenager can make more handing out vials on a corner, and his mother makes in a month cleaning offices that night. The risk is obvious. So is the reward. The result is a new kind of territorial war. These corners are not just places. They are franchises. Whoever controls the corner controls the income. So control is enforced with weapons. Fists, then knives, then stolen pistols, and eventually automatic guns. Disputes stop being arguments and become shootings. Residents, mothers, grandparents, kids find themselves living on a battlefield that never declares itself a war zone, but behaves like one. While this is happening on the street level, another transformation is unfolding behind closed doors. The crack house, an abandoned or neglected apartment, a cheap motel room, an empty building in a block no landlord cares about. Inside, a single mission: smoke, recover, smoke again. Furniture doesn't last long. It's sold piece by piece for more rocks. Food disappears. Children, if they live there, are often left to fend for themselves. The outside world looks at these places with horror. News cameras roll. Anchors use phrases like urban blight and crack dens. What rarely makes the script is how they begin, not with monsters, but with ordinary people who took a hit, then another, and then found themselves rearranging their entire lives around chasing 5-minute highs. And then, the children. The media of the late 1980s fixates on a terrifying phrase: crack babies. Stories pour out about infants born to mothers addicted to crack, predictions of a permanent, lost generation, damaged beyond repair, before they take their first step. The reality, as later medical research would show, is more complicated and less uniformly apocalyptic than early coverage claimed. But in the moment, the image sticks. Small bodies, shaking, mothers demonized on screen, a racialized panic that fuses drug use, poverty, and blackness into one easy target. The public fear hardens into political certainty. Something must be done. And Washington, D.C. is a city that knows how to turn fear into law. In 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act arrives like a thunderclap. On the surface, it's tough, decisive, clear, mandatory minimum sentences, harsh penalties for dealers, a firm line between drugs and decency. At its core, buried in the numbers, is a ratio that will haunt the country for decades. 5 grams of crack equals the same mandatory minimum sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine, a 100-to-1 disparity. On paper, the logic presented is clinical. Crack is more addictive. Crack is associated with more violence. Crack is destroying inner cities. Therefore, crack should be punished more harshly. In practice, this translates into something much simpler and much uglier. Who is more likely to be caught with crack? A wealthy executive snorting lines in a penthouse, or a young man smoking rocks on a corner in a H? Who is more likely to be arrested for possession of 5 grams of anything? A Hollywood producer with a lawyer on speed dial, or a single mother found with a small rock in her purse? Police saturate poor, predominantly black neighborhoods. Street-level possession and tiny sales are treated as felonies. The same drug molecules that float through corporate parties and VIP rooms now carry radically different consequences depending on their form and location. Powder gets probation. Crack gets prison. Courts fill. Prisons overflow. An entire generation of young black men, and many women as well, are pulled out of their communities and locked away for years for small-scale, non-violent drug offenses. The law does almost nothing to touch the higher tiers of the trade, the importers, the major suppliers, the people laundering millions. It shatters families at the bottom of the pyramid. Children grow up with a parent missing. Neighborhoods already struggling with poverty now face a second blow: mass incarceration hollowing out their social structure. All the while, the core engine of the crack trade remains intact: demand, profit, supply. If one dealer disappears, another steps in. If one corner gets shut down, another opens 3 blocks over. On television, the crack epidemic is portrayed as a kind of moral infection, spreading from bad people. In reality, it is an intersection of chemistry that maximizes intensity and craving, economics that push cheap highs into desperate communities, policy that punishes the most visible users while leaving the deeper machinery untouched. The same white powder that once lived in crystal vials in a European laboratory, the same alkaloid that helped runners cross mountain passes, now sits in small, scorched glass pipes in abandoned houses and in plastic evidence bags in overcrowded courtrooms. 5 minutes of heaven, hours of hell, and far away, in counting rooms and cartel ranches, the money made from those 5 minutes continues to stack quietly, brick by brick, into fortunes that will never see the inside of a cell. By the mid-1980s, America had declared war on cocaine at home. Mandatory minimums, SWAT raids, just say no on classroom posters. On the evening news, you saw battering rams, drug sweeps, perp walks. It felt, at least on television, like the state was hitting the problem hard. But there was another theater of this war, far from the cameras in American living rooms. If cocaine was destroying cities, someone reasoned, then maybe the answer lay not only in arresting dealers, but choking off the supply at its source. The logic sounded clean, almost agricultural. If the problem is cocaine, and cocaine comes from coca leaves, then we simply need to get rid of the plants. Easy to say in a policy meeting, harder to live with in the Andes. Imagine you're a coca farmer in the Colombian or Peruvian countryside. You don't see yourself as part of a global crime machine. You see bad roads, poor soil, and a government that remembers your village mostly at election. Coca is the one crop that always has a buyer. Coffee prices crash. Corn rots before it gets to market. But coca, someone will come up the mountain and pay cash. Then one day you hear an unfamiliar sound. The low, constant thrum of engines overhead. Planes. They fly low, too low for comfort, tracing slow lines over the hillsides. A mist begins to fall on your fields. It isn't rain. It's herbicide, glyphosate, and other chemicals drift down, coating coca plants. But not only coca plants. Nearby, cassava, bananas, coffee bushes, even wild vegetation, all drink in the same poison. Over the following days, leaves curl and blacken. Plants that were meant to die do, but so many that were never part of any drug trade. Chickens peck at contaminated soil. Cows graze on tainted grass. A child comes back from playing in the fields with a rash no one can name. From the air, the operation has a simple name: eradication. From the ground, it feels like a cure. The idea behind these programs is simple on paper. Destroy the crops, coca becomes harder to source, cocaine prices rise, demand falls, problem solved. Reality, as usual, is less cooperative. When aerial spraying wipes out coca in one region, the farmers don't suddenly become software engineers or tour guides. They move deeper into the forest, cutting down new patches of jungle to plant again. The trade has a name for this: the balloon effect. Squeeze one end of a balloon, the air doesn't disappear. It simply bulges somewhere else. Destroy coca in one valley, it reappears in another, often in an even more remote, harder-to-reach place. While the planes are spraying, another arm of the war is working on a different theory. If you cut off the head of the snake, the body dies. The head, in this case, is not the farmer or the street dealer, but the kingpin. Men like Pablo Escobar and the leaders of the calicartel had become, by the late 1980s, larger-than-life figures, part villain, part folk hero, part walking political crisis. They weren't just rich. They were de facto power centers. They bribed judges, bankrolled politicians, built entire neighborhoods. They also bombed buildings, murdered public figures, and turned city streets into battlefields. For Washington and for fragile Latin American governments, these men were more than criminals. They were an existential threat. So a new strategy took shape: extradition treaties, joint task forces, intelligence sharing, special units trained and funded to hunt the most powerful traffickers. The message was clear: you can be the richest man in your country, but if your fortune is made of powder, we will come for you. The search for Pablo Escobar became almost mythic. Wiretaps, informants, helicopters over Medellin. Elite police units, moving like. Escobar responded not by hiding quietly, but by escalating. He bombed a commercial airliner in an attempt to kill a rival politician. He ordered assassinations of judges, journalists, presidential candidates. He unleashed car bombs in downtown Bogotá. For a time, it felt less like law enforcement and more like a civil war between a state and a private army funded by cocaine. Eventually, after years of bloodshed, Colombia, with heavy U.S. backing, cornered him. In 1993, Pablo Escobar died on a Medellin rooftop. His bare torso sprawled beside a shattered window, his famous mustache smeared with blood in the photographs. Politicians in Bogotá and Washington breathed out in relief. The snake had lost its most terrifying head. But something unnerving happened next. The body did not die. The cocaine trade shuddered, paused, and then rerouted. The calicartel stepped into the space Medellin left, leaner, quieter, more corporate. They preferred boardroom. Where Escobar had embraced the spotlight, Cali tried to become a shadow. Their operations were breathtakingly methodical. Cocaine dissolved into chemical shipments, hidden in frozen produce, embedded in construction materials, washed through banks and companies around the world. At their height, they controlled a huge percentage of the world's cocaine supply and did it with far fewer explosions. Still, the kingpin strategy persisted. One by one, Cali's leaders were exposed, arrested, extradited, or pressured into surrender. Again, there was talk of turning points, of major victories. But the same pattern repeated. The great Colombian cartels were dismantled. Yet cocaine didn't vanish from American streets or European clubs. Instead, the trade reshaped itself, shifting its center of gravity north, toward a country that had long been a subcontractor in smuggling but was now ready to become something else. Mexico. For years, Mexican smuggling groups had been the last-mile service providers. Their job was simple and dangerous. Take cocaine shipped from Colombia into Central America or Mexico and move it over the U.S. border. They were paid a fee, a price per kilo for transportation. But as the Colombian cartels weakened under pressure, the Mexicans saw an opening. Why be the driver when you can be a partner? Instead of cash, they began demanding payment in product, first a small percentage, then more and more. Before long, Mexican organizations were not just couriers. They were owners. They built their own distribution in American cities, hired their own networks, cut their own deals. The hydra that policymakers thought they were killing by cutting off the Colombian heads had simply grown new ones closer to the U.S. border. The money and firepower flowing into these groups allowed them to mutate into something beyond traditional. They bought politicians. They armed themselves with military-grade weapons. They trained ex-soldiers as enforcers. They controlled towns, regions, sometimes entire corridors of a country's territory. In some areas, they filled roles the state had abandoned, paving roads, handing out food, paying for festivals and church repairs, settling disputes in their own brutal way. To villagers neglected by distant governments, a cartel boss could look disturbingly like a governor or feudal lord. Meanwhile, U.S. policy kept doubling down on the same broad themes. Spray crops, fund militaries and police, hunt the biggest fish. Every time one large organization was shattered, its territory and roots were fought over by smaller, more volatile groups. Violence spiked. Local communities bore the brunt. The Hydra, it turned out, did not mind losing a head or two if it meant more room for the others to grow. From Washington's vantage point, maps were marked with arrows and numbers, shipments seized, labs destroyed, hectares sprayed, leaders captured. From the vantage point of a farmer in Putumayo, a villager in Guerrero, or a teenager in a border town, the picture looked very different. Soldiers and police on the roads, planes overhead, armed men, sometimes wearing uniforms, sometimes not, demanding loyalty or silence. In theory, this was all in service of reducing the flow of cocaine into the United States. In practice, demand in the wealthy North remained remarkably stable. Users in New York, Los Angeles, Miami, London, Madrid did not see eradication planes. They saw plastic bags, neat lines, club bathrooms, party tables. They didn't hear the word extradition. They heard, "My guy has good stuff tonight." The deeper irony of the foreign war on drugs is hard to escape. The richer a country is, the more it can afford to be the customer. The poorer a region is, the more pressure it faces to become the battleground. Fields in Colombia and Peru. Ports in Ecuador and Brazil. Transit routes in Mexico and Central America. Coastal towns in West Africa for shipments bound to Europe. Spray, raid, arrest, repeat. Sometimes the snake's head was cut. Sometimes the body was wounded. But somewhere, so long as the money remained good enough, someone was always ready to pick up a blade, hire a chemist, pay a pilot, or hand a gun to a boy who had never held a steady job. War was declared on the supply, yet the quiet engine of demand kept humming, and the powder, indifferent to flags, speeches, and borders, continued moving along its routes. Smuggled in ever more inventive ways, created in ever more hidden labs, financing ever more powerful and fragmented criminal worlds. The war abroad had not stopped the flow. It had changed who controlled it and how much blood was spilled along the way. By the time the big Colombian cartels were crumbling, another creature was already taking shape just to the north. It didn't roar onto the stage with bombings and airplane attacks the way Medellin did. It grew like mold in the dark, quiet, persistent, feeding on every crack in the wall. From the outside, Mexico still looked like a normal country. A flag, an anthem, elections, courts, tourist beaches, pyramids, bustling cities, mariachi and plazas at night. But in certain regions, if you scratched the surface even lightly, you found something unnerving. A second power structure, layered on top of the official one, or threaded right through it. The narco-state, not a separate country with its own flag, but a kind of ghost government that answered to bullets and money instead of ballots. It didn't appear overnight. It evolved. At first, Mexican smugglers were just that. Smugglers. They ran contraband, alcohol during Prohibition, cigarettes, small-time drugs. Across a border, they knew better than any map in a government office. When cocaine surged in the 1980s, they were the couriers of choice. The Colombians sent product up through the Caribbean and Central America. The Mexicans took it the last step, across rivers, deserts, ports of entry, into the veins of the U.S. market. They were paid like truckers, per kilo, per load. Then, they did what any clever contractor does when the main supplier looks weak. They renegotiated the deal. "Don't pay us in cash," they said. "Pay us in product." At first, the share was small. Then it grew. 10%, 30, 50. With each percentage point, the balance of power shifted. The Colombians were still growing, refining, exporting. But north of them, Mexican organizations now had something far more valuable than a fee: inventory. They no longer just moved cocaine. They owned it. They could sell it themselves, build their own networks in U.S. cities, and keep the profit margin instead of a courier's wage. The fall of Medellin and Cali didn't decapitate the trade. It decentralized it. and made room for Mexican groups to become full partners, then dominant players. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, El Padrino, did something visionary and frightening in the 1980s. He unified previously independent smuggling clans into what became known as the Guadalajara cartel. It was less a company and more a federation, a board of powerful men who agreed not to tear each other apart, at least not yet, in exchange for control of plazas, the smuggling corridors into the United States. Each plaza was a lucrative gate. Control the gate, control the flow. Control the flow, control the money. For a while, the system worked. But criminal federations are like tectonic plates. They look solid until when Félix Gallardo was arrested in 1989 after the kidnapping and murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena created a political firestorm. His empire didn't vanish. It's fractured. Each lieutenant seized his piece of the structure and rebranded it. In the Northwest, the Arellano Felix brothers anchored themselves in Tijuana. In Juarez, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, built an empire using fleets of Boeing 727s to fly cocaine loads. In Sinaloa, a group of traffickers, among them a short, ambitious man named Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo, began consolidating power. The map of Mexico's underworld redrew itself. Different colors, same business. As cocaine profits swelled, these organizations stopped looking like gangs, and more like hybrid creatures, part corporation, part army, part feudal clan. Their first weapon was money. Bribery, plata, had always existed. What changed was the scale. Local police chiefs, mayors, customs agents, state governors, generals, federal officials, all were now within reach of narco budgets. A policeman making a modest salary was offered more in a single envelope than he'd see in several years of pay. A mayor of a dusty town, forgotten by national politics, was suddenly visited by men who could pave roads, fund festivals, build a clinic or a church. All he had to do was cooperate or stay quiet. Some refused. They met the other half of the equation. Plomo, lead, a bullet in traffic, a body dumped on a roadside, hands bound, a note pinned to a corpse, a message to everyone else. This is what refusing looks like. Many took the silver. Enough tasted the lead that the offer didn't have to be repeated often. Corruption in Mexico didn't spread like a stain. It became the operating system. In some regions, the lines grew so blurred that people stopped bothering to distinguish between police and cartel because they often arrived in the same uniforms, in the same trucks, asking the same questions. But bribery and assassination were only half the story. The other half was substitution. In neighborhoods and rural areas where the state was weak or absent, cartels stepped in to do something both cynical and effective. They acted like a government. They paid for a lot of things. School uniforms for kids, roofs for damaged churches, food baskets in hard seasons, medicine for sick elders. They sponsored local festivals. They handed out cash at Christmas. They offered protection from other criminals, from rival gangs, sometimes even from abusive local authorities. If two neighbors had a dispute, they didn't always go to the official police. They went to the local jefe. Yes, he might oversee kidnappings and executions. Yes, his men might be the reason other people suddenly disappeared. But he also had the money and muscle to get things done. In a vacuum of state presence, narco bosses became feudal lords. Loyalty was purchased, but it was also cultivated, sometimes even genuinely felt. Then came a new escalation. If you are a cartel boss, flush with cash, and facing threats from rivals and the state, what do you buy after politicians and police? You buy an army. Some groups had always employed gunmen, but around the late 1990s and early 2000s, the nature of these men changed. Enter Los Zetas. Originally, they were elite Mexican special forces, trained in advanced tactics, proficient with heavy weapons, steeped in counterinsurgency doctrine. Then some of them switched employers. They left the army and went to work for the Gulf Cartel as an enforcement wing. What they brought with them was a new way of doing violence: coordinated urban assaults, ambushes, radio and encrypted communication use, training camps for recruits, disciplined small unit operations. They treated cities and highways like battlefields. They brought military doctrine into the drug war. Other cartels took note. They began recruiting ex-soldiers too, building their own paramilitary wings. The arsenals grew heavier. AR-15s and AK-47s became standard. 50 caliber rifles capable of punching through engine blocks, rocket-propelled grenades, improvised armored vehicles, monstros, trucks plated in steel like rolling bunkers. The imagery shifted. No longer just men with pistols in alleys, but convoys of armored pickups, gunmen in tactical gear and balaclavas, patrolling like a parallel army. The Mexican state, for all its resources, found itself facing enemies that looked less like criminals and more like insurgents. Sometimes the two sides clashed directly. Sometimes they coexisted uneasily. The starkest illustration of how far the balance had tilted came on a single afternoon in 2019 in the city of Culiacan, Sinaloa. Mexican security forces moved in quietly to arrest Ovidio Guzman Lopez, one of El Chapo's sons and an important figure in the Sinaloa cartel. For a few minutes, it seemed like a clean success. Then the city erupted. Within an astonishingly short time, hundreds of cartel gunmen mobilized. They didn't just skirmish. They took the city. Roads were blocked with burning vehicles. Heavily armed men seized intersections, fired on military housing complexes, took hostages, and even surrounded locations where soldiers' families lived. Videos flooded social media. Trucks mounted with machine guns rolling openly through the streets. Convoys of masked men coordinating movements. Residents crouching under tables as bullets cracked outside. For hours, Culiacan was effectively under cartel control. The Mexican government, watching the chaos, faced a brutal calculation: keep Ovidio in custody and risk a massacre, civilians, soldiers, perhaps a full-blown urban war, or let him go. They chose to release him. The order came from the top: to avoid further bloodshed, stand down and free the prisoner. On paper, it was a decision made in the name of public safety. In reality, it was a public admission of something darker. In that place, on that day, the state was not the strongest armed actor. The narco-state had, however briefly, won a direct contest of force. For people living in regions like Sinaloa, Tamaulipas, Guerrero, Michoacán, this was not a shocking revelation. It was a confirmation of what they already knew in their bones. The government could appear, disappear, change parties, change uniforms. The local cartel, it was always there. You might hate it. You might quietly benefit from it. You might fear it. You might even work for it. But you could not ignore it. That is what a narco-state really is. Not a flag on a new map, but a slow, creeping takeover of the functions that make a state feel real. A power to tax, extortion, and protection payments. The power to judge, settling disputes, punishing offenses. The power to kill, monopoly on violence, or at least competition for it. That is what a narco-state really is. The power to provide. Jobs, handouts, local infrastructure. Built not on law, but on the profit from a single, fragile, bitter molecule that once lived quietly in a green leaf in the Andes. A molecule that now, after passing through labs, planes, borders, and noses, funds an invisible, shifting architecture of power just across the border from the richest country on Earth. By the late 1980s, the United States was already soaked in cocaine. The big coastal cities had their scenes, their dealers, their wars. Wall Street had its performance powder. The inner cities had crack and the ruin that followed. For the Colombian cartels and their new Mexican partners, the American market was a gold mine, but it was also starting to feel crowded. Prices were no longer climbing the way they once had. Competition was fierce. Law enforcement, while far from perfect, was no longer sleepwalking. If you were sitting in an office in Medellin or Cali with a ledger full of numbers and a map on the wall, you'd eventually have the same thought any ambitious business has. Where's the next market? You'd turn east. Across the Atlantic lay a continent that looked, from a trafficker's perspective, almost too good to be true. Wealthy cities, busy ports, open internal borders in many regions, and a culture where nightlife, clubbing, and festivals were already integral to youth identity. Europe. At first, the attempts to penetrate this new market were tentative, almost clumsy. A courier on a commercial flight from Bogota to Madrid with a suitcase double-lined and smelling faintly of chemicals. A container of coffee beans bound for Rotterdam or Hamburg with a few extra, very special bags buried deep in the hold. These early moves were probes, tests of customs routines, airport security, shipping inspections. The Colombians quickly learned something crucial. Europe was not one country. It was a patchwork of systems, languages, and police forces that didn't always talk to each other. That patchwork was a challenge. It was also an opportunity. To navigate it, they needed partners, people who already knew how to move illicit goods across the continent's arteries of trade. In the Mediterranean, they found exactly what they were looking for, an old, quiet criminal order that had waited decades for the right global product. The 'Ndrangheta, while the Sicilian mafia basked in the world's attention, with movies, myths, and flashy trials, the 'Ndrangheta worked in the background. Rooted in Calabria, in the toe of Italy's boot, they had a different style, less cinema, more spreadsheets, less spectacular butchery, more contracts and connections. Their real advantage was geographic and logistical. They had their fingers wrapped around one of Europe's most important maritime choke points, the container port of Gioia Tauro. Gioia Tauro is the kind of place that makes law enforcement sweat just looking at the numbers. Enormous ships arrive, stacked with tens of thousands of containers. Inside those containers, everything the global economy runs on: toys, electronics, frozen food, textiles, machinery. Buried among them, somewhere, could be one box filled with neatly wrapped bricks of cocaine. Good luck finding it. Unless, of course, the people who run the docks are working for the people who packed that box. The 'Ndrangheta understood containerization the way others understood turf and streets. They knew which crane operator could be bought, which customs official had debts, which union boss liked to gamble. When the Colombians came knocking, the deal was straightforward. You get the product across the ocean. We'll make sure it walks off the ship unnoticed and into the heart of Europe. Cocaine started sliding into Italy in frozen food shipments, in pallets of fruit, in metal parts cast with hollow spaces, in seemingly ordinary cargo that no overwhelmed customs officer. From Gioia Tauro, the web spread outward, trucks up to Milan, trains toward Germany and Switzerland, onward to France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Scandinavia. The Ndrangheta didn't just move the product, they invested in the above-ground economy as well. Restaurants, construction, shipping, real estate. Dirty money washed itself clean in the swirl of legitimate commerce. But as volumes increased and European authorities slowly began to adapt, direct routes from South America to Mediterranean ports grew riskier. The traffickers, looking at the same world map, saw a new opportunity in a place that many of their customers barely thought about: West Africa. On that coastline, from the Sahel down toward the Gulf of Guinea, lay a stretch of countries with fragile institutions, porous borders, and long histories of smuggling other commodities: timber, arms, people, diamonds. If you were a Colombian or Brazilian trafficker planning shipments to Europe, West Africa offered three powerful advantages. It was closer to South America than Europe. Many states lacked strong, well-funded law enforcement. There were existing black market routes and players you could plug into. So the pattern shifted. Instead of sending a freighter straight to Spain or Italy, large ships would sail toward the bulge of West Africa. Well offshore, far from casual observers, they would rendezvous with smaller vessels, fishing boats, trawlers, sometimes fast launches. Waterproof wrapped bales of cocaine, hundreds of kilos at a time, would be transferred at sea. Those smaller boats, hugging poorly monitored coastlines, would slip into remote estuaries or hidden beaches under cover of darkness. Onshore, local contacts, corrupt officials, militias, seasoned smugglers would receive the load. Countries like Guinea-Bissau earned a new, chilling nickname in foreign policy circles: a narco-state in miniature. Not because the entire economy was cocaine, but because the drug trade had enough money to twist key parts of the government into tools: paying off military officers, buying silence from ministers, turning ports and bases into staging grounds. From West Africa, the product would be repackaged and pushed north, carried by couriers on commercial flights to Paris, Lisbon, Brussels, Amsterdam, hidden in air cargo, moved overland through the Sahara and up through North Africa into southern Europe. Europe's borderless Schengen zone, designed for free movement of people and goods, also became a freeway for illicit cargo once it crossed the perimeter. A truck that leaves Spain with fruit destined for Belgium rarely gets opened again along the way. As time went on, the web thickened. The Colombians were no longer the only suppliers. Brazilian, Venezuelan, and other South American groups joined in. On the European side, the Ndrangheta remained central, but they were no longer alone either. In the Balkans, the collapse of Yugoslavia and the chaos of post-communist transitions had birthed tough, adaptable criminal organizations in places like Serbia, Albania, Montenegro, and Kosovo. These groups were already experienced in running guns, people, and contraband through the region. Cocaine was just another high-value item. They became the overland logisticians, trucking shipments from southern ports into Central and Northern Europe, handling distribution in cities from Vienna to Stockholm. Enforcing deals was a level of violence learned in civil wars. Farther north, in the ports of Antwerp and Rotterdam, the true lungs through which Europe breathes in global trade, a newer generation emerged, the so-called macro mafia. They specialized in infiltrating the docks, port workers on payrolls, corrupted security staff, hackers who could alter container data to misdirect inspections. A container might arrive from Ecuador or Brazil, be marked as containing bananas or coffee, and be quietly delivered to a supposedly ordinary warehouse. By the time anyone in customs realized something was wrong, if they ever did, the cocaine bricks were long gone and the container returned to circulation. Europe's relationship with cocaine evolved quietly. Unlike the US, which had the very public, explosive drama of the crack crisis, Europe's surge was more discreet. The drug seeped into club culture. Lines in nightclub bathrooms in Berlin and London, bumps behind bars in Barcelona, festival tents in Belgium and the Netherlands, where music pounded and eyes shone too brightly. In office towers in Frankfurt and Zurich, white-collar users mirrored their American counterparts from a decade earlier. A little powder to push through long hours, to stay alert, to feel sharp. The consequences, addiction, health crises, corruption, violence, undeniably existed, but they were scattered across borders, diluted by the continent's diversity of laws and institutions. No single European crack moment defined cocaine in the public mind. Meanwhile, the places that served as transit points paid a concentrated price. West African communities saw new money arrive suddenly. Luxury SUVs in poor neighborhoods, villas with high walls, young men with guns and no clear employer. Local politics bent around these new gravitational centers. Some tried to fight, some joined. Some simply tried to survive in the middle. In Italy, judges and prosecutors who dared to challenge the 'ndrangheta faced threats, bombings, and campaigns of fear reminiscent of earlier. In the ports of Northern Europe, journalists who dug too deeply into dockside corruption found themselves on hit lists, their murders shocking societies that had long imagined organized crime as something that happened somewhere else. Through it all, the product at the heart of this web stayed the same: a fine white powder derived from a modest Andean leaf that almost no clubgoer in Ibiza or banker in Zurich had ever seen growing in the soil. Cocaine had become what it always seemed destined to be in a globalized age. Not just a drug, but a commodity threaded into the roots of international trade. Packed in the shadows alongside televisions, avocados, mobile phones, and car parts, riding the same container ships and cargo planes, feeding an underground economy that stretched from jungle labs to European dance floors, passing through villages in West Africa where most people could not afford a single gram of the substance that was warping the politics of their country. The web had expanded. America was no longer the only main stage. Europe and West Africa had become both customers and collateral in a story spun from a single bitter alkaloid that refused to stay in one place. By the time the cocaine trade had wrapped itself around the globe, from Andean valleys to New York clubs, West African ports to European night trains, you might have thought the story had settled into a grim equilibrium. People snorted, cartels shipped, governments chased, a bloody balance, but a balance all the same. Then something slipped into the picture that wasn't grown in soil, wasn't chewed in rituals, and didn't care about sunlight, altitude, or harvest seasons. It didn't come from a leaf. It came from a lab. Its name was fentanyl. At first, it didn't arrive as a villain. Fentanyl began as a medical tool, a powerful painkiller, carefully dosed, used in surgeries, and for patients in severe, often terminal pain. In hospital settings, it wore a white coat. But outside that setting, stripped of careful measurement and sterile procedure, it was something else entirely, a synthetic ghost that could fit on the head of a pin and still be enough tea. Where heroin had once seemed terrifying, fentanyl dwarfed it. Micrograms instead of milligrams. A dose so small it's almost invisible. 2 grains of salt worth, for a naive user, can be the difference between waking up and never waking up again. For traffickers, this was not a horror story. It was a business opportunity. Unlike cocaine or heroin, fentanyl does not need fields or farmers. You don't wait on weather. You don't worry about blight, pests, or eradication planes. You need precursor chemicals, modest equipment, and a space out of sight. From there, 1 kilogram of pure product can be cut into hundreds of thousands of doses. High potency means high profit. For a while, fentanyl lived mainly in the opioid world, mixed into heroin, pressed into counterfeit pain pills, swept up in what people came to call the third wave of the opioid crisis. But then, quietly, it began to show up somewhere unexpected, inside cocaine. In coroner's reports and toxicology labs, doctors noticed a strange pattern. A person found dead with white powder on the table, cocaine in their wallet, a history of weekend partying, but no known opioid use. The cause of death? Respiratory depression, not the heart attack or stroke you'd expect from a pure stimulant overdose. When they dug deeper, the signature appeared: fentanyl. At first, the explanations were hopeful. Maybe these people had mixed drugs knowingly, done speedballs, a stimulant plus an opioid, chasing a particular kind of high. But case after case told a different story. No heroin in the system, no track marks, no history of pill abuse, just cocaine and fentanyl. So how does a stimulant and a supercharged opioid end up in the same bag? Sometimes the answer is sheer carelessness. Street-level dealers handle multiple products on the same table, use the same scale, the same scoop, the same bagging station for heroin or fake pills and for cocaine. Fentanyl, being so potent, doesn't need to be present in large amounts to cause chaos. A dusting left behind from cutting another batch is enough to contaminate the next one disastrously. But increasingly, the mixing wasn't accidental. From a cold, predatory business perspective, fentanyl has certain advantages. It's cheaper than cocaine. Cutting cocaine with a tiny amount of fentanyl stretches the expensive product further. You can sell stronger bags while actually using less real cocaine. And for those who survive the experience, fentanyl's powerful opioid pull can create a new kind of craving. The user thinks they are just using cocaine, but their brain is now being tugged by an opioid they never chose. They go back to the same dealer, chasing the same indescribable kick, unaware that the chemistry of their nights out has changed. The combination is a cruel joke. Cocaine pushes the system up, heart racing, thoughts speeding, energy surging. Fentanyl pulls the system down. Breathing slows, consciousness dims, the body drifts toward shutdown. Taken together, they can mask each other's warning signs. The user may feel less sedated than they would on pure opioids, less jittery than they would on pure cocaine, and wrongly assume they're in a safe, manageable zone. They aren't. Behind the scenes, the heart and lungs are playing tug-of-war with substances that don't negotiate. The settings for tragedy are painfully ordinary. A music festival, a birthday party, a night out with coworkers, a weekend reunion with old friends. Someone offers a line. The crowd is laughing. The music is loud. The person thinks, "It's just coke, I've done it before." They have no reason to imagine a synthetic opioid, thousands of times stronger than the coca leaf's original magic, is hiding in the same powder. They bend down, inhale, stand up, and return to the party. Minutes or an hour later, things go wrong. They slump, stop talking, slide to the floor. Friends think they've overdone it, or assume it's alcohol or exhaustion. Precious minutes pass. By the time someone notices the color of their lips, checks their breathing, calls an ambulance, the window to pull them back may already be closing. Narcan, naloxone, can yank a person away from fentanyl's grip, but only if someone on the scene actually has it and recognizes what's really happening. Most casual cocaine users don't see themselves as part of an opioid crisis. They don't carry reversal kits. They don't think their drug of choice is in the same room as fentanyl. But the supply chain sees no such boundaries. Upstream, in clandestine labs and cartel ledgers, everything is just product. Powder A, powder B, pills, rocks, liquids. Interchangeable in bags, shared in warehouses, compartmentalized only by price and risk. Fentanyl, once it's in the system, doesn't care whether the end user believes in uppers or downers. It simply lands on receptors in the brain, flips a switch, and slows the lungs. In this sense, fentanyl is cocaine's dark mirror. Cocaine promised a sharp, bright edge to life, a feeling of invincibility, a few hours where exhaustion and doubt are drowned out by certainty and speed. Fentanyl promises nothing. It doesn't give you visions, doesn't make you talkative or clever, doesn't wrap itself in disco lights and mirrored tables. It offers oblivion wrapped in numbness, and when it's mismeasured, it offers it permanently. The numbers on overdose deaths began to tell a new story in country after country. Not just opioid users dying, but polydrug deaths, cocaine plus fentanyl, meth plus fentanyl, party drug cocktails with an invisible extra ingredient. From the trafficker's vantage point, this did not automatically look bad. Their calculus is different. If one user dies, another will replace them. If profit margins are better because cheap synthetics can be slipped into expensive powders, the balance sheet stays healthy. In the shadow economy built on white powder, human lives are just one more consumable. For the public, the rules of the game changed without warning. What had always been risky became Russian roulette. A decade earlier, a person taking a line at a party might have been gambling with addiction, legal trouble, or a heart strain. Now, they might be gambling unknowingly with a single lethal contaminant measured in grains of dust. The most chilling part of fentanyl's arrival in the cocaine era is this: it collapses categories. Once the drug world was neatly divided in people's minds: hard drugs versus party drugs, downers versus uppers, junkies versus recreational users, opioid world versus cocaine world. Fentanyl erases those borders. You can be a person who has never touched heroin, never swallowed a pain pill that wasn't prescribed, a social cocaine user who shows up to work on time and pays their rent, and still die of an opioid overdose because the supply chain quietly changed the recipe. The synthetic shadow moves faster than public understanding. Warnings lag, laws lag, culture lags. The chemistry does not. Somewhere, far from the dance floor or the kitchen table where a line is cut, a synthetic opioid is being measured out in a backroom. It will travel through hands that never meet, across oceans and borders, through warehouses and stash houses, until it lands in the same small bag as cocaine and waits. A few hundred micrograms of almost pure indifference. The coca leaf's long story, from sacred ritual to colonial tool, from tonic to nightclub accessory, was already soaked in blood. Fentanyl doesn't rewrite that story. It accelerates it. The powder that once promised to make you feel more alive now sometimes carries, hidden in its grains, the quickest route away from life altogether. If you stand at the edge of a rainforest clearing at dawn, before the engines start and the first chainsaw screams awake, you wouldn't think you're looking at the front line of a global drug economy. The air is heavy with mist. Birds call from somewhere in the dense green. Leaves drip slowly, still holding last night's rain. Then you notice the stumps. Blackened circles, raw and jagged, scattered like broken teeth across the soil. Here, the story of cocaine is not about parties or cartels or police raids. It's about what has to be destroyed so the world can snort a feeling. Coca doesn't grow in the middle of mature rainforest. First, the trees have to die. The process is brutally simple. Men come with machetes and axes. Trees that took centuries to rise come down in hours. What won't fall easily is girdled, poisoned, or burned. The forest floor, once shaded and moist, is suddenly exposed to a harsh sun. Vines shrivel. Small creatures flee or don't. The smell of sap and smoke replaces the smell of damp soil. On this scraped skin of earth, coca is planted. Rows of neat, low shrubs where a tangled cathedral of life once stood. It doesn't last. The Amazon and Andean foothills are rich in life, but the soil is often thin and fragile. After a few seasons of intensive coca cultivation, the nutrients are exhausted, yields drop, pests increase, weeds creep in, so the growers move. A new patch is cut, more trees fall, more ash drifts into the sky. From above, on satellite images, you can see the pattern spreading like a disease. Green, then polka dots of brown, then scars of pale earth that never quite recover. But the trees are only the first casualty. Coca on its own is just a plant. To turn it into cocaine, you need chemistry, and the jungle labs, hidden under camouflage tarps and branches, are not designed with the environment in mind. Barrels of gasoline and kerosene line the edges of clearings. Sacks of lime, cement, and caustic soda pile up under makeshift roofs. Drums labeled with the names of acids and oxidizing agents stand half-rusted in mud. The process of turning leaf into paste and paste into powder is essentially industrial chemistry carried out without any of the safeguards we'd require of a normal factory. Solvents are poured, acids are mixed, waste is produced in staggering quantities. And when the mix is done, and the crystals scraped, and the product wrapped and flown away, what happens to the leftovers? Nothing elegant. Waste pits overflow and leach into soil. Used barrels are simply tipped into ravines. Rivers become the default trash can. Toxic sludge, full of hydrocarbons, acids, and heavy metals, seeps into waterways that feed entire communities. Fish die. Livestock sicken. People downstream drink from water that looks clean enough, carrying a slow, invisible poison into their bodies. For every single gram of cocaine that ends up in a nightclub, multiple times that weight in chemical waste has already been dumped into some forgotten corner of forest or river. No one adds that to the price at the bar. The environmental damage would be tragedy enough, even if institutions were strong, politics were clean, and communities were safe. But cocaine eats its systems the way its production eats its soil. Corruption is not just a side effect of the trade, it is one of its core technologies. Imagine you're a police chief in a rural province. Your salary is modest. Your officers lack fuel, equipment, sometimes even boots. One afternoon, someone you've known for years invites you to dinner. The food is good, the wine is better. At the end, a proposal slides across the table with the casualness of a bill. All you have to do is look away at certain times. Let certain trucks pass. Not ask too many questions about certain airstrips. In return, you can put your children in better schools. You can fix your house. You can pay off old debts that have kept you up at night. Refuse, and the consequences aren't limited to your bank account. Everyone knows stories of others who refused. A colleague shot leaving his house. A judge whose car exploded. A mayor whose body was found on a roadside with a note pinned to his shirt. The message is always the same. Choices have consequences. So people choose. They convince themselves it's temporary. They convince themselves they're doing it to protect their families. They tell themselves they still serve the law in other ways. And brick by brick, office by office, the institutions that are supposed to defend the public are hollowed out. A police station where half the officers are on the cartel payroll is not really a police station anymore. It's a branch office. A courthouse where certain cases never see trial is not a place of justice. It's a filter that lets money through and catches only the powerless. Over time, corruption ceases to feel like an exception. It becomes the default. Young recruits entering the force see bribes as part of the job. Politicians learn that campaigns are impossible without donations from powerful interests. Elections still happen. Laws are still passed. But a second invisible draft of those laws is already written elsewhere in smoke-filled back rooms and guarded ranches. Call this what it is, the slow-motion capture of a state. Cocaine money doesn't just buy people, it buys silence. A journalist starts digging. At first, sources are chatty, off the record, of course. Then the calls stop being returned. A stranger follows their car. A threat arrives, a picture of their child's school, a phone call describing their daily routine in unsettling detail. Some back down, some don't. Those who don't sometimes become headlines themselves, in stories written by their colleagues about another murdered reporter. In this way, information itself becomes a casualty. What the public knows about the trade is only what the trade allows them to see. Behind all of this, the poisoned soil, the bought officials, the silenced voices, are people whose lives are consumed at every stage of the chain. At the very bottom is the cocolero, the coca farmer. He is not a kingpin. He is usually a poor peasant with limited choices, growing the only crop that will reliably pay enough to keep his family from starving. On one side is the trafficker who buys his harvest. On the other is a government that sends planes and soldiers to burn his fields in the name of an international war. He lives squeezed between two kinds of violence, the illegal and the official. Above him are the workers in the labs, men and sometimes boys who stir toxic vats, breathe solvent fumes, and can be killed or disappeared if they talk too much or ask the wrong questions. Then the mules, the young woman who swallows dozens of latex-racked pellets and boards a flight, knowing that if just one bursts inside her, she will die alone in an airplane bathroom, far from home, and buried under an anonymous tag. The man who straps packages to his body and walks across a border under a neat shirt, heart pounding, practicing his calm face in his mind over and over. Then come the enforcers, the sicarios, teenagers in many cases, raised in neighborhoods where the cartel is the only employer that seems to be hiring, handed a gun and a motorbike and a code. Obey. Don't ask. Don't hesitate. They learn to live with a kind of moral numbness because the alternative is to feel everything and shatter under the weight of it. Above them, higher still, are the bosses, the men with estates and private zoos, or penthouse apartments and offshore accounts. They live in a strange blend of paranoia and privilege, surrounded by bodyguards, fortified walls, electronic security, and haunted, always, by the knowledge that every ally could become a traitor. Every phone call could be tapped. Every moment of apparent peace could be the calm before an arrest or an ambush. And at the very top of the pyramid, not socially, but causally, is someone who doesn't see themselves as part of this system at all, the user. The person at a party who says, "It's just a line, I do this sometimes, no big deal." The person who sees the powder as personal fun, a private vice, an individual choice with individual consequences. It's not that they're evil. Often, they are decent, ordinary people trying to squeeze a little more light from a weekend or a long night. What they rarely see, what the entire surface of the trade is designed to hide, is the chain that connects their rolled banknote to a burned hillside, to a poisoned river, to a compromised election, to a mother crying outside a prison, to a child wondering why the forest is gone and why strangers with guns decide so much about their life. Cocaine's greatest trick was never just its high. Its greatest trick was this: to compress a global system of destruction into something that looks, to the end user, like a harmless line of white on glass, a moment of escape, a moment of power, a moment of brightness. Paid for in forests that won't grow back for centuries, in institutions that may not recover for generations, and in human lives that do not get second chances. If you stayed with this story, from the thin air of the Andes to the neon glare of nightclubs, from jungle labs to stock exchanges, you might be wondering something very simple. What is this really about? Because on the surface, it looks like a story about a drug, about chemistry and crime, cartels and cops, planes and powder. But if you zoom out, if you let all the details fall into patterns, you start to see something else. This isn't just the history of cocaine. It's a history of what people think they're missing and what they're willing to trade to fill that gap. Think about every place the coca leaf or its white descendant appeared. High in the mountains, where breathing hurts, the leaf was a promise. You can endure. In the silver mines of Potosi, it told exhausted men, you can work beyond what your body allows. In 19th century Europe, cocaine in wine and tonics whispered, you can be less tired, less sad, more productive, more alive. In the offices and studios of the 1980s, it said to the ambitious, you can stay sharp, stay awake, stay ahead. In forgotten neighborhoods, battered by poverty, crack murmured something darker. You can forget. For 5 minutes, you don't have to feel this life. And in the era of fentanyl, the mixture says almost nothing at all. It just offers a door that some people walk through and never return. Different centuries, different continents, different languages, but the same quiet ache under everything. I am not enough. My life is not enough. I need more. More strength, more energy, more status, more escape, more silence inside my head. The powder never created that ache. It just marketed itself as the shortest route around it. Then there's the second layer of the story. It's tempting to tell this as a morality play about villains and heroes. The evil kingpin, the corrupt politician, the brave agent, the innocent victim. There is truth in those roles, but the deeper pattern is colder and more mechanical. Cocaine flourished wherever the system made certain choices seem rational. If your farm can't feed your family, and the only crop that reliably pays is coca, then growing coca is not wickedness, it's arithmetic. If your police salary cannot cover your rent, and a briefcase of cartel money appears alongside a whispered threat, then corruption is not just greed. It's also fear management. If a government has been absent from your town for generations, but the local narco boss builds schools, sponsors festivals, and settles disputes, then loyalty is not simple blindness. It's pragmatism. If you live in a culture that measures success in money, speed, and performance, and a powder lets you work longer, network harder, dance further into the night, then taking a line is not pure hedonism. It's an attempt to match a pace that never slows. The cocaine story is really a story about systems. Economic systems that leave some people on the edge of survival, political systems that treat some lives as expendable, cultural systems that confuse worth with productivity and appearance. The drug just flows along the channels those systems carve. There's also a third thread, the illusion of distance. At one end of the chain is a quiet hillside in Peru or Colombia. At the other end is a bathroom in a bar, a backstage, a bedroom. Between them stretch forests, rivers, borders, guns, cash, chemical vats, and bodies. The user, at the far end, often feels alone with their choice. It's just them and the mirror, just them and the little bag, but unseen hands are resting on their shoulder. The farmer who cut down one more patch of forest. The mechanic who fitted a plane with secret compartments. The girl who swallowed pellets before boarding a flight. The teenager with a gun on a corner. The judge who looked away. The journalist who didn't and paid for it. None of these people ever meet the person taking that line. Yet they are connected, strand by strand, in a network spun by one small, bitter molecule. That's part of cocaine's terrible magic. It turns global consequences into something that looks personal and private. A moment, a mood, a choice that seems to belong only to one person in one room. The opposite illusion happens at the top. Politicians declare war on a substance. Planes spray fields. Soldiers patrol jungles. Agents pose with seized bricks in front of cameras. It looks like the state is attacking the problem at its root. But the root is not a plant. The root is desire. Desire for profit at one end. Desire for relief, confidence, or oblivion at the other. You cannot bomb desire. You cannot spray it from the air. You cannot sentence it to mandatory minimums. You can confront it, understand it, redirect it. Try to build a world where it does not need to express itself through a line of white on a table. But that is harder than passing a law. So what do we do with all this? This is not a bedtime lecture telling you that every user is a monster or that every person in the trade is irredeemable. The reality is more uncomfortable and more human. Some addicts are also victims of trauma, illness, and despair. Some traffickers are also fathers, mothers, children of poverty and war. Some officials who took bribes once tried to resist and paid a heavy price. Some agents who fought cartels also ignored the larger policies that kept demand high. No one in this story is purely one thing. Maybe what this history offers us is not a neat moral, but a lens. It lets us see how a single product can reveal the fault lines in our world. Where there is inequality, cocaine grows. Where there is hopelessness, crack smokes. Where there is unchecked ambition and status worship, powder lines appear on glass. Where institutions are weak, cartels become governments. Where emotions are stigmatized instead of understood, people seek chemical shortcuts to silence them. Cocaine is not the origin of these cracks. It is the white dust that settles into them and makes them visible. If there is any lesson here for an individual listening in the dark, it might be this: be suspicious of anything, a job, a drug, a relationship, an ideology that promises a shortcut to feeling like more powerful, more lovable, more in control, more numb. Shortcuts often borrow from the future. They give you a few moments of what you want and send the bill later with interest. For some, that bill arrives as addiction. For others, as prison. For others, it comes due in a forest that will never fully grow back, or in a country where citizens no longer trust courts and police. And yet, this story is not only about destruction. Hidden in it is a quiet reminder of what doesn't get headlines. The activists who track illegal logging, the judges and journalists who refuse the envelope, the ex-addicts who help others climb out, the communities that say no to narco money and yes to the slower, harder work of building something legitimate. They rarely appear in films. Their names don't travel far, but they too are part of the history of cocaine, the part that pushes, gently and persistently, back against the idea that this is how things must always be. So as you lie here, at the end of this long, winding story, from sacred leaf to deadly powder, from empires of gold to empires of fear, you can let one simple thought settle with you. This was never just about a drug. It was always about us, about what we chase, what we tolerate, what we ignore, and what we're willing to change in our own lives and in the systems we live inside. The powder's story is written in blood and profit, in chemicals and cash, but the next chapter, whatever it becomes, will be written in something smaller and stranger. The quiet choices millions of ordinary people make about what they value, how they cope, and what they refuse to build their comfort on. You don't have to carry all of that tonight. For now, it's enough to know that behind every simple story about a dangerous drug, there is always a deeper story about the kind of world that drug grew out of, and the kind of world we might still decide to grow instead. Some stories end with a bang. This one doesn't. Cocaine's history is full of gunfire, sirens, explosions, headlines. But the part that belongs to you tonight is much quieter. You're not on a jungle airstrip. You're not in a cartel meeting. You're not in a courtroom or a lab. You're here, breathing slowly, eyes growing heavier, with this long, tangled story still echoing in your mind. So let's set the noise down for a moment and just walk through the silence at the edge of it. We followed a leaf from the high Andes to the silver mines of Potosi, to European laboratories and Victorian medicine cabinets, to Coca-Cola fountains, Freud's desk, jazz clubs, Hollywood mansions, Wall Street offices, crack houses, cartel compounds, West African ports, and finally into the synthetic shadow of fentanyl. We've seen emperors, priests, chemists, popes, gangsters. So tonight, instead of trying to remember every name and date, you might hold on to something smaller, a feeling, a way of looking at the world, because beneath all the details, a few simple truths kept repeating themselves, like the same quiet drum beneath different songs. The first truth is this: nothing we consume is truly just ours. Whether it's a drug, a diamond, a cheap t-shirt, an app on your phone, everything has a trail. Behind every object in your hand is a chain of people and places. Someone who grew or mined or built it, someone who shipped it, someone who profited more than the others, someone who might have been hurt in the process. Cocaine just makes that invisible chain brutally obvious. A line on a mirror sounds so small. A moment at a party seems so private. But hidden behind that moment are clearings and forests, mules on plains, judges with envelopes on their desks, mothers waiting outside prison gates, bullet holes eye. Most of the time, the world works very hard to keep those connections out of sight. Cocaine shows us what they look like when the disguise falls away. You don't have to feel guilty for every object you've ever used. That's too heavy for any one person to hold. But you can remember this: nothing is truly weightless. Everything lands somewhere. The second truth is this: shortcuts always collect their price. Cocaine's promise has always sounded something like, you can have the thing without the journey, energy without rest, confidence without growth, euphoria without meaning, escape without change. That's what made it so tempting everywhere it appeared. The Inca runner facing the mountain pass, the miner facing another day underground, the stressed banker facing another 14-hour workday, the exhausted parent facing a life that feels like a dead end. All of them are, in their own ways, up against a wall. Cocaine says, don't climb it. But the door is rented, not owned. You step through for a moment and it closes behind you. And each time you return, the rent goes up. The same pattern appears everywhere. In personal lives, in politics, in economics. Quick fixes that promise to skip the hard parts often shift the hard parts onto other people, onto the future, or onto parts of ourselves we don't listen to until they scream. A quiet, slightly uncomfortable lesson wraps itself around that idea. When something offers you a feeling of being more without any effort, it is almost always borrowing that more from somewhere. From your health, from your relationships, from your future, from someone else's safety or dignity. Cocaine just happens to do that very loudly and very fast. The third truth is gentler. Most people in this story were not born villains. It's easy looking back to point at a Pabloescobar or a cartel leader and say, monster. And yes, some acts are monstrous. But look a bit deeper down the chain and you see a farmer who wanted his children to eat, a teenager who wanted a job, a user who wanted the noise in their head to stop, an official who wanted to stay alive, a performer who wanted to keep the audience happy, a worker who wanted to keep their job in a brutal economy. Those wants are not alien. They're not even rare. You've probably felt softer versions of them yourself. That doesn't excuse the harm that followed, but it does remind us of something important. The line between us and them is thinner than we like to believe. Under enough pressure, in the wrong circumstances, with the wrong options on the table, good people can become cogs in very dark machines. If there's a takeaway here, it might be this. Instead of only blaming individuals at the bottom of the pyramid, we can also ask, what kind of world makes those choices feel like the least terrible ones? A world where entire regions are abandoned, where some people's pain is invisible, where success is worshipped and exhaustion is normal, where loneliness is epidemic, but vulnerability is mocked, where feeling overwhelmed is standard, but asking for help is not. Change those conditions even a little, and the obvious choices start to look different. The fourth truth looks inward. You are allowed to want relief, but you deserve better sources for it. Underneath cocaine's long success story is something extremely human. We are tired. We are scared. We are lonely. We are chasing something. We are afraid of failing, of being left behind, of not being enough. You are not wrong for feeling that way if you've ever done so. You're human. The question is not, why do people want relief? The question is, do we build lives and societies that offer any relief that doesn't come with a hidden detonator. Healthy rest, real connection, work that doesn't consume you, communities where you can say, "I'm not okay," and not be punished for it. Those things sound small and unglamorous next to the myths of powder and power. They don't make headlines, they don't fund empires, but they are the opposite of everything cocaine represents. Slow instead of instant, sustainable instead of explosive, shared instead of secretly hoarded, rooted instead of weightless. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you don't have to solve the drug trade, redesign economies, or fix the justice system. You can start much closer to home. You can ask yourself quietly, where in my life am I tempted by shortcuts? Where do I numb instead of listen? Where do I say I'm fine when I'm not? Where am I consuming something, anything, that I know is built on someone else's suffering, and pretending it doesn't matter? These are not questions to punish yourself with. They're questions. If Cocaine's story shows us how deeply harm can travel outward, your story can show how small acts of awareness and care can also travel outward. Choosing to rest instead of overwork, to talk instead of numb, to be curious instead of judgmental, to ask how things are made instead of just what they cost. These are not dramatic acts. They're tiny resistances against the logic that built the cocaine empire. And now, at the end of all this, you can let the big picture grow blurry. The leaf, the powder, the labs, the wars, the money, they can fade. You don't need to hold the whole planet in your hands tonight. You can just hold one simple, quiet thought. I am part of a web. What I do touches others. What I choose shapes my own future. I don't have to be perfect, but I can be a little more awake. That's enough for now. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your jaw unclench. Feel the weight of your body sinking into whatever holds you up. Outside, the world will keep turning. Forests breathing in the dark. Cities humming. Waves carrying ships with containers of everything, good and bad. For this moment, you don't need to track all that. You've walked a long way through this story. You've seen what a single white powder can do. Now you get to do something it never offers. You get to stop, to breathe without chasing, to rest without paying for it in fear. Close your eyes whenever you're ready. The past will still be there in the morning. The future can wait its turn. Tonight, after so much noise and motion, your quiet is not just an absence. It's a small, gentle rebellion against a world that keeps trying to sell you shortcuts. And it's yours.